All right, so we're here with several other people to have a discussion on what's wrong with the world. So, first, we're going to go around and introduce ourselves and give a brief accounting of our ideas, very brief, and then we'll have what I hope is going to be a lively discussion on what's wrong with the world and how to make it a little bit better. So, I guess, Todd, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Todd Lewis. I write at thepraiseoffolly.wordpress.com. I've done some work with Keith Preston and some work with you, Dave. So it'll be good to keep on doing this.
Yeah, it'll be fun. We're hoping to turn this into a longer series discussing ideas in the modern world from perhaps a more Burkean or traditional perspective. I guess I'll go next. I write at datadistributist.wordpress.com. I go by the handle Modern Distributist. Yes, I just generally have a lot of interest in ideas, but I typically come at it from a more Burkean or traditionalist perspective, with some smattering of ideas like libertarianism and distributism mixed in. And I'm just here to try to discuss ideas and make sense out of the world. So I guess, Alex, do you want to go now?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Alex Miller. I run a website called answeringtheright.com, just sort of commentary. And I come from a pan-leftist perspective, and I support the struggle of all oppressed groups as I see it.
Great, excellent. So the subject of today's discussion is going to be what's wrong with the world. To give you a background to this question, this was the fundamental question that G.K. Chesterton answered in a series of essays in the early 20th century that kind of led to the formation of this concept called distributism, which was this weird kind of, traditionalist, socialist kind of idea. But I thought it would be a good way to kind of kick off what we think is wrong with the world and where there might be some common ground. And then I think after we discuss that, maybe get some common ground, I foresee that we'll have a little bit more disagreement about what the solutions are. So perhaps, I guess the same way, Todd, do you want to just talk about modern problems in the world?
Sure.
What you think the big problems are and the issues going forward?
Yeah, well, I think that we can divide the problems into two categories, right? There's what we call the spiritual, theological problems, and then there's the more physical, material problems. Now, as Christians, you and I would argue that the ultimate problem is sin, man's rebellion against God and his perfect laws, which is outworking through the world now. And, of course, we would also agree that only his son, Jesus Christ, can fix the sin problem. But that's the big picture. That as far as what's wrong now, how is sin manifesting itself now? We can start by looking at large, unaccountable institutions like governments, corporations, and universities. Large, centralized institutions that are not accountable to really anybody and can do more or less what they see fit, which is not good for the rest of us. The other thing that we could see is the problem with the world is the fact that we see a complete collapse in families. I mean, the idea that you have more and more children are being born out of wedlock. It's constantly moving up, and we see the social damage that does. We can look at the collapsed families in the inner cities. We can look at the at-risk children due to not having two parents that are able to meet their physical and psychological needs. And we can also look at the rise of violence in America. I mean, the level of violence that individuals are willing to resort to, like the gang wars or the shootings that we see. And the idea of a shooting in a movie theater 50 years ago would have been inconceivable.
Yeah, the nature of violence has changed. So maybe I'll pick up a little bit from that, since I agree with a lot of that. I can just add on, and then we can keep on adding on, hopefully. So I would definitely agree with most of what you said, Todd. Us coming from somewhat similar backgrounds, that's not surprising. I think another large problem is that there are several mechanisms by which people typically saw a lot of problems with wealth and standard of living and general solutions to problems arising that no longer seem like options. Previous to the time that we're currently living in, we had a very, very large growth rate in this country, and that allowed us to essentially bury all the problems we had in just money, right? People always had an increasing standard of living because of the incredibly high growth rate of the economy, and technology would provide a continuously increasing standard of living. Because of that, a lot of these problems with a disintegrating family, the lower work participation rates that have been increasing for the recent period we've been living through, these problems were mitigated by that continuous growth rate. But now we're seeing what I think two effects are happening. The growth rate's kind of tapering off a little bit, and then also what we're having an understanding that technology is not always going to solve all of our problems and may in fact create more of them. We're seeing automation get to the point where it may in fact start replacing not just unskilled labor but skilled labor, and we're seeing the fact that truly scary technologies like genetic manipulation, massively rampant artificial intelligence, those technologies might be just on the horizon, and our confronting of that possibility that technology might be a problem in itself has not really been conceived of in the modern mind. So I would add that on, and that exacerbates the problems we have with malnutrition and the like.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alex, do you want to add on to anything?
Sure. I mean, I can agree with a lot of that, of course. I may not be a Christian, but I can see where a lot of Christians are coming from. In a sense, I feel that, the family is definitely weakening, and that really is a problem. There's not a lot to add. I mean, I agree with a lot of what y'all are saying. Even if I'm not necessarily a traditionalist, it makes a lot of sense. I would just recast it, I suppose, as the struggle of different groups that are and as you already talked about, institutions that are unaccountable. I would argue, of course, by the system of capitalism itself, by the way it's matured over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
I might have to ask you questions because I know Todd and I already discussed this, but what do you mean by capitalism? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, that's a great question. But
people use it for a lot of different things, and depending on your definition, we might very much agree with you or not agree with you.
Right. Yeah, and it's hard to come up with a definition that's fair to everybody and everyone's going to agree on. But I would.
What did you mean when you used it, though?
I mean the system of so capitalism involves, I'd say, 4 essential elements. The first is strict private property norms. The second is profit seeking or capital accumulation, that kind of thing. The third is just making sure I get all my bases here. Third is let's see.
You can summarize if you like. Yeah. I'm just trying to get to the core of what you don't like about it. That's all.
Oh, what I don't like about it? Well,
because for instance, I mean, I can't speak for Todd, but from myself, I'm concerned about our capitalism's elements where they take power away from the individual. I kind of like private property norms because they allow people a certain degree of autonomy in their lives, where if things are owned in collective, that's typically not the case.
Right.
So, I mean, already we're seeing a point where there might be some disagreement, right?
Right, sure.
Not that I think we don't need to look for disagreement right now, but I'm just pointing that out.
Yeah, and like I said, I wish I'm better at writing when it comes to the definition.
Don't worry about it. So you also mentioned about I kind of interrupted you, so keep on going.
Well, I guess I was just saying that I agree. I do see a lot of the institutions we have that are bearing down on even, like I said, the family structure, the individual. Group autonomy is being suppressed in a lot of different ways. And I do find that rather distressing. Other than that, I mean, like I said, a lot of my beef does come with government and capitalism, though I'm also not necessarily an anarchist. I'm more of just a libertarian socialist in the literal sense of the term. So.
And that's we've I think Todd and I have complained about both terms, both libertarian and socialist terms. What?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, a lot of libertarian thought is really shaky, and especially when it comes to libertarian right thought. Yeah.
And you could say the same thing about socialism too, right?
Yeah, I mean it has its problems. I'm not going to deny that, but that's part of the reason we need to learn from the past, from the USSR and other countries. So.
I mean, frankly, I'm kind of surprised we're agreeing so much. Alex, do you think there's anything that we critically left out of that statement of the problems in this world? I mean, I guess I could add a few more on too. It would be more cultural, but.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, we're going to disagree. Ultimately, I do believe in, for instance, that capitalism itself ought to be abolished at some point, or done away with in a democratic manner at some point. I do disagree with, I don't know, like, I guess just lately I've been coming to sympathize a lot more with people who come at it from a traditional standpoint, because I've been researching a lot of the moral psychology behind politics, and I've started to say, oh, I can see that side of it. So
here's the problem, though. The desire to abolish capitalism is the simple part. That it's the replacing the systems that it delivers.
Right.
That's the difficult part.
Yeah.
I mean, people have been wanting to abolish large conglomerations of wealth for as long as humans have been alive on this planet, essentially. So I mean, okay, but
if you don't
that's
mind,
the problem.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to bring out that really almost, in fact, it's so far from being seen as a problem, one could argue it's an alternative religion, is the cult of science that we have today. A lot of times the left will criticize institutions like capitalism, institutions like the state, but the left, as far as I can tell, never criticizes the institution of organized science. And the institution of organized science, I mean, I guess we could trace its foundations back to the end of World War II, with the Manhattan Project and all of the massive.
So do you mean like you mean the sort of what we would call big science, like huge research labs, huge scientific international communities?
Yeah, because what we see with this and what you and I think would call this is scientism. Mm-hmm. It's like when some scientist comes on the air and says, well, there's no evidence for God, or we know this or that about science. But here's the thing, though. What they do is...
Tyson. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
Sorry.
No, but what I'm saying is...
I apologize.
The origin of this big science goes actually back to Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and a circle of people that were arguing for what they called the New World Order. In fact, H.G. Wells wrote a book called The New World Order. And
it's kind of funny. I'm doing some research on that right now.
They wanted to create a scientific dictatorship whereby there be an elite class of scientists that rule the world. And we can see this in 1984 and Brave New World, where these are each imaginings of this new system. And the rest of us are just guinea pigs in a petri dish for these people to work on. And really, there's this tremendous dehumanization that occurs with this. People are seen as means to an end, not ends in themselves. And so really, if something can be done scientifically, it should be done. It's a moral imperative that it be done, even if the cost is, well, I mean, look at the atom bomb project. It had to be done. It was a moral imperative to move the frontiers of science, even if you had to incinerate, 250,000 people to do it. And we could see this with the Nazis, with the communists, and with modern-day democracies. Science must advance no matter the cost, no matter who has to pay for it, no matter who gets hurt by it.
Well, it really sounds like there's two different issues you're talking about here. One is the organizational apparatus of scientific communities and technological advancement that could be a problem. Then there is sort of the intellectual movement of scientism and scientific progressivism, right, which probably existed before a lot of these big scientific communities did. So yeah, but both I think are potentially very dangerous to human liberty and human flourishing, and in a
Yeah,
very
and really,
particular way too.
but really, no, the vast majority of people don't see that as a problem. They see science as an unqualified good that its advancement, well, for instance, for you and I, stem cell research, right?
Hmm.
That people that like the Pope who are against fetal stem cell research because it's cannibalizing fetuses. Well, that has to be done because it's advancing science. It doesn't matter if you consume a living human being in the process.
Hmm.
That's the kind of mentality. This dominant. Oh, it's the mentality of libido dominandi that Augustine talks about. This lust to dominate. And in fact, when people are not willing to submit to their place as guinea pigs to the scientists, they get upset. They're like, how dare you? We have a divine right to rule over you and genetically engineer you or cannibalize you for cloning or whatever we want.
Yeah, I think the community I always think about when I think about scientism are the people from the Singularity movement, in particular Eliezer Yudikowsky, if you're aware of his work.
No, but I have heard of Ray Kurzweil. He's also from the Singularity.
Yeah, he's a person in that community too. But Yudikowsky has this idea of sort of replacing humanity with super intelligent AI that will sort of be like gods among themselves. I mean, there's so much. It's kind of funny because I know a little bit about artificial intelligence, and with the limited amount of knowledge I know, I am aware of so many disastrous ways this could go wrong. But somehow, regardless of Yudikowsky's incredible intelligence, he can't think of any way this could possibly go disastrously wrong. And I find it hilarious. I mean, how could somebody not see how dangerous this is?
Well, you're right.
That's
the other thing is people like Bertrand Russell, for example, who's a hero amongst this cadre of people.
Maybe we should explain who Bertrand Russell is for an audience who might be listening to this.
Sure. Bertrand Russell was a famous, I think he was an analytic philosopher, right? And he was
also a famous mathematician, too.
That's right. And he wanted to actually write a unified theory of mathematics, but Gödel's theorem kind of undermined all that.
Absolutely.
I think he was going to do that with Whitehead, if I'm not mistaken, but that didn't quite work out. But he was also a famous social commentator from a sort of left-wing perspective. And one of the things that we see, the kind of mindset of people like that, is rather glibly, he talks about releasing biologically engineered weapons to cull the human race once it becomes too populous. And he glibly talks about, through science and technology, democratic regimes achieving the same kind of control over an individual that heretofore only totalitarian regime could implement.
Yeah, this was common among early 20th century progressives like Russell and H.G. Wells. People typically don't remember this about the early progressive movement, but it was a very common opinion there, right? Eugenics was very popular.
George Bernard Shaw argued for the invention of a humane gas that they could use to liquidate unwanted individuals. He said that every year you would have to go before a state board and convince them you produced more than you consume, and if you couldn't convince them, you'd have to be liquidated with the humane gas. This is what I mean.
That's like the ultimate performance review.
Well, I mean, you can actually listen to where he says this on YouTube. There's actually a recording of him saying this.
No, I'm sure there is. It was a common view, and I think you can sort of see that view coming back a little bit with some people like Daniel Dennett or Dawkins has toyed with eugenic ideas in his more out there speeches, but then I think he might have retracted them. So who knows where he stands?
Well,
Alex?
Yeah, I was going to just make a point here, which is that, I mean, you all are making some excellent points about, say, the way science has been used in different ideologies and different governmental structures, and so on. But how do we distinguish scientism as something independent of other, say, structures and beliefs and so on? Like, we could surely, with these early 20th century thinkers, we could look to their ethics, right, and blame a lot of the ethics. Science can't really inform us about ethics by itself, right? Science seems to me And I know this is a little bit of a naive view when it comes to certain.
Todd, can you hear Alex? Pardon me, I'm having.
Yeah, it's hard. His mic's really cracking up.
I can hear you, but it's a little bit rough. If you want to adjust it.
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there, but is that better?
Is this any better?
That sounds a little bit better. Please continue.
Right. But what I'm saying is that science seems to me to be more of a tool to try to get around some of the problems in trying to come to empirical conclusions about the patterns in the universe and the world. Whereas if we look at the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, or we look at the eugenics movement, they seem to be separate ideologies or structures using science. And so can we really say there's a distinct scientism that exists outside of them?
Yeah, I think I would say that we can. And I would define scientism very broadly as well, I mean, I don't know. It's like any ideology. It's like saying it is certainly an abuse of science, but it is the use of science in fields that manifestly contain no scientific questions, and it's the cloaking of ideas in the language of science in order to sort of give them a moral authority where science has developed a long-standing epistemological authority. I think those are the qualities of scientism. Do you disagree?
No, that's kind of interesting. Science is a cloak for oppression, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly has. Well, actually, Alex, you're still cracking up a little bit, but I have a real important question. Do you want to try it one more time? And maybe if you, I don't know if you plug your microphone in or out again or whatnot. Maybe
before that though, I mean, just remember in America where they involuntarily sterilized people in the 1920s. What was it? Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Yeah.
And they forcibly sterilized the woman. I mean, so this idea that science is liberatory is nonsense. I mean, it's liberatory in the sense that we don't have to break our backs out in the farm field, but it's not liberatory in the sense that we're free from political oppression. Political oppression is perfected in science.
Yeah, this is a great treatise done to this in a book called The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis.
Yep.
Where he outlines that science is essentially neutral to any kind of ethical governance of society. All it does is sort of increase our power over nature. So we can't not. It sort of destroys the progressive narrative that by necessity, time itself will cause people to become more ethical or things to become better. Which I think
better.
What? Oh, that's I think that's much better.
Yes. Sorry.
So I had one really important question to ask you, Alex, and this is a question I have to ask a lot about people who are from a more progressive perspective. What do you mean by oppression? Because I've heard that applied so broadly that I don't even know really what it means anymore. I usually think of oppression from a traditionalist point of view as like really extreme exposure to tyranny, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good question. Oppression means different things to different folks, and that to define it exactly is quite difficult. But what I mean when I say that is,
yeah, I guess when I ask you what a word means in this context, I'm just asking what you mean. I'm not asking you to speak for everyone in a movement.
Right. Yeah, and I wouldn't pretend to. You can never do that.
Yes.
But for me,
but what do you mean by oppression?
Well, what I mean by it are historical systems of subjugation and domination. So for take instance, sexism, racism, so the sort of worker control that comes out of capitalism, the state domination of in the private sphere and public sphere. That's sort of where I'm going with a lot of this.
Okay, I don't quite understand. For instance, if I were to say oppression exists somewhere or somebody is oppressed, like if I were to say Joe is oppressed, what would I be telling you about Joe?
Well, it would depend on the nature of the situation, I suppose. I mean, when we
you began this by saying you support the movements of all oppressed peoples. So that implies that you have some way of discerning what's an oppressed person from a non-oppressed person,
right?
Or at least oppressed group of people.
And I outlined some of the spheres where you do see oppression. For, like I said, racism, which is the domination of one race by another that considers itself superior. Sexism, which has been manifested in patriarchy in a historical
Is
perspective.
classism then oppression?
Yeah, and I got into classism when I talked about capitalism and control of workers and things like, what's it called? Sort of sort of scientific management. I would consider that a form of capitalist oppression.
I hope you forgive me for belaboring the point, but I am very interested in this because everybody is exposed to a little bit of all of those things. So if we say that exposure to any amount of those qualities makes you an oppressed person, then we would say that almost everybody in the society is oppressed, and moreover, almost everybody in all of history has been oppressed.
Yes, I would agree with that, definitely. Sorry.
So when you say you're for the movements of oppressed peoples, you're just saying you're for people in general?
Hold on, Dave. Let me try to explain this. I think I can explain this in a way that might satisfy you as kind of a bridge.
Excellent. Yes.
Okay, so from somebody from Alex's perspective, he would say as a libertarian socialist that the goal is to maximize human autonomy across the board, and human autonomy, I think you would probably define, Alex, as being self-directed. Right? You do what you're not.
Right.
Other people aren't directly telling you what to do. You're self-directed, and so what he would say is that these structures that he would call patriarchy or sexism or statism or capitalism are in some sense impinging on my self-directedness. I can't do what I would like to do because, for whatever reason, maybe obligations, maybe threats of force, maybe economic disadvantage, I can't do what I'd like to do. So, and those things are considered oppressive because they limit his self-directedness, his autonomy. Is that a fair description, Alex, of how you would describe oppression?
It's kind of tricky. I mean, and I admit it's a tricky undertaking to describe what oppression is, but I would argue that.
Does that help, Dave?
That is excellent, Todd. I also get the sense that in order to be oppression, it can't just be a constraint on autonomy. It also has to be a constraint on autonomy that's put in place by another agent, like a person or a ruler. Like people aren't oppressed by the rain, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, Kropotkin would point out that if the natural world, the physical world, puts fixed limitations on what we do, but he would not call that oppression because there's no active, intelligent will behind it. So Kropotkin would say, yeah, I'm not oppressed by the fact that, I'm limited to my physical body, so granted, transgender issues weren't an issue back then, but, for him, because he couldn't be a woman or because, he can't fly, he's not being oppressed by nature because there's no active will behind it. Whereas if he's not allowed to, maybe buy what he wants, or well, actually, in his day, probably something he would have cared about is free love. So if there was a government telling him that you can't love whoever you want, he would consider that oppression. But I want to get back to something we mentioned about science. There's this general view that science is itself.
Did we lose somebody? I think we might have lost Alex. Should I re-invite him?
Yeah, definitely do that.
Hold on, let me go back to the.
But Dave, do you think I explained his position?
I think you did. I mean, that would be a great explanation. I mean, for me, it was very satisfactory. Oh, looks like he's back.
Okay, are you back now?
Alex. Hey, man. Okay, awesome. You're back. Okay, great.
Yeah. There was something I wanted to bring up about science. It's a common view that science is kind of like a neutral tool, value neutral, and that people can use it.
I agree with that, actually.
But hold on a second. This is where I agree that I argue that it's not. So Roger Bacon, one of the known founders of modern science, wrote in 1605 a work called The Advancement of Learning. And then he says in The Advancement of Learning, hence we are beholden to Machiavel and writers of that kind who openly and unmasked declare what men do in fact and not what they ought to do. For it is impossible to join the wisdom of the serpent and the innocence of the dove without a previous knowledge of the nature of evil, as without this virtue lies exposed and unguarded. Now,
but that sounds like he's saying that we have to be cautious not to confuse moral imperatives with empirical observation.
But hold on a second. The leading Machiavelli scholar, Harvey Mansfield, one of the leading Machiavelli scholars, Harvey Mansfield, writes that Machiavelli is kind of a paradigm shift. He says that, rather than writing political theories about what men should do, like Plato and Aristotle, and Aquinas and Augustine, we should write political theory about what men do. And he wrote a play called The Mandragora, or The Mandrakes. And the idea is there's a man who's sterile, and his wife and him want to have a child as an heir. There's a younger man who wants to sleep with a married woman. And so in the Mandragora, there's an agreement that the younger man gets to sleep with the married woman as long as they get to claim the child as their heir. And so Machiavelli is saying, if we break the moral norms, we both get what we want. And that's the mentality that Bacon picks up in the scientific method. That these constraining bonds of morality prevent us from getting what we want. And really, science is not a value-neutral tool. And that's, in fact, why, from the very beginning, we've always seen science claiming that religion, ethics, social norms are shackles on scientific progress. And, of course, whenever those shackles get cast off, we see things like the atom bomb and the poison gas and the gulag. And what I'm saying is it isn't value-neutral. It's actually predicated on this notion that their ethics cannot bind what science does.
Yeah, I guess, this is the thing. I think you're pointing out a distinct danger in science. I guess there's a difference between saying that there's a danger in science and saying that something has an inherent,
Well, let's put it this way. In a strictly logical sense, you're right. Can you do science without doing all these things? Yes, of course you can. But what I'm saying is, if we observe the historical development of science, this is how it historically developed.
Yes.
So, and that is.
I can say the same thing about capitalism and government and
exactly.
Every large institution of power has naturally developed these problems in it because it's run by people who are fallen people, and they do.
Yeah, well, you're right. You're right. But when the original premise is rotten as Bacon's original premise, that casts doubt proportional to the error on the succeeding movement.
Yeah, I guess to me, it's just one of many things. Like I said, like capitalism, like government, like any human institution, this thing is going to have. It has problems in its inception. It's got problems going forward, and we have to work to mitigate those problems and be aware of them. I think scientism becomes a problem when we think that science is sort of some kind of pure angelic thing and not subject to moral question.
Isn't that to some degree committing the genetic fallacy, though, to look at the founder of something and then say, well, he said this, or he had this attitude, and so that's going to create problems, or that creates problems with successive movements? Isn't that just the genetic fallacy?
Well, if you're saying that X is false by giving an account of how X generated, yeah, that's the genetic fallacy. But, for instance, the left will often point out the original propositions and founders of capitalism, and they'll draw from that, well, given the false conclusions that, say, Adam Smith had, or other founders of classical capitalism, they'll then say, well, already baked into that system of thinking is certain errors that lead to certain dangerous results that we've seen over and over and over again. And what I'm saying is, if you apply that left-wing critique of capitalism, if you were to apply it to science, you'd get something similar to what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's all that I'm doing. All I'm doing is saying, if you would apply the same, and again, the liberal left never criticizes the power structure of science, which, in fact, all these totalitarian regimes do what they do because they have the scientific ability to do it. The surveillance mechanisms, the advanced weaponry that allows a small amount of people to control a large amount of people. And I'm saying the left isn't consistently applying that principle, and if they were, they wouldn't be quite have such a science fetish. But I think, back to Dave, your point is, you said that science doesn't have to be done that way. Have you heard of Ivan Illich?
Oh god, I feel like I have.
He wrote about what's called instrumentality. So basically, he says that in the traditional way of thinking, classical, medieval, the tool that somebody used was tied up with their identity and their vocation. So if you used a sword, a sword was not seen as a chopping device that anybody could use. It was seen as a tool used by soldiers. A hammer was not seen as a random nail-pounding device that anybody could use, but a tool used by a blacksmith. So it was kind of embedded.
You can see this manifested in medieval coats of arms, right?
Yeah.
Where families are sort of labeled by the tool that originally characterized the caste of their ancestors, right?
And so what I'm saying is, Ivan Illich identified this change sometime in the modern era, where man was, in the medieval sense, the tool served man. Or as Christ would say, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But sometime in the modern age, it was flipped. Man was to serve the machine.
Yes.
And
that's, or yeah, you could say capital became so valuable that it kind of subsumed the craftsman in the production process of the thing in question.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, for Illich, science could be restored, quote unquote, if you could go back to some kind of instrumentality view, rather than this.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, I see where you're right. Does science have to be this way? No, it doesn't. But historically, it has, and we get the same rotten results over and over again, and we shouldn't be surprised that we're getting them now. That's kind of the whole context. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very similar criticism to the criticism of large banking and capitalism itself, right?
Exactly.
The question is whether. So I'll put my general caveat here. These things like big capital and large industries were developed because large economies of scale are sort of essential to driving the growth rate of the global economy and production in general, and it's always a very hard thing if you can essentially return to sort of the instrumentality of an earlier age without losing all of the wealth generated by the Industrial Revolution.
Well, that is kind of the trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Alex, what do you think about that analysis?
That's pretty interesting. I do wonder about that because I'm aware of the system of craftsmen and craftsfolk, and of course the tool was associated. You had shoemakers and all that. I'm sure we're all familiar with all of it. But is it that
doesn't the
once we transition?
mean shoemaker?
Yeah, I mean I was just giving an example of one, but nonetheless, I guess the question really is, did we really transition from a system where where the machine serves the individual to where the individual serves the machine or the tool? And I don't know, that seems a little bit broad to me. But when it comes to capitalism, sort of getting back to that particular subject, I mean, corporations, a lot of people hate corporations. But the reality is that they are not a result of governments going in and just saying, well, we're going to favor this one group. A lot of people assume that it's risk pooling, wherever you find inherently risky industries, people are going to try to minimize their risk and pull their capital together, and that creates capital or corporations.
Joint stock corporation was essentially a risk mitigation exercise.
Yeah. So it's limited, like the limited liability companies.
Yeah, and that was a later development to the joint stock corporation, but the motivation was very, very similar.
Yeah, so it drives me crazy when libertarians try to say, oh, no. If you just let capitalism do its own thing, you won't get corporations because governments aren't helping people.
But wait, what's your alternative to? I mean, I have a lot of problems with the modern corporate structure, and it certainly does have a lot of problems. But I mean, the issue I always bring up is the corporation will crumble away the second we put something into place that allows people to aggregate large amounts of capital, for risky endeavors, with a minimized liability. And I never hear that subject really addressed, I guess, and it's And that's the key issue, right? Because it can't be it's like, oh, let's get rid of corporations. I don't know any country that's gotten rid of corporations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky damn topic. That's the reality of it. And what the approach I tend to take is looking at, okay, well, what institutions do what work right now? And is that work necessary? And if so, how do we go about trying to find a replacement that's going to be suitable for a free society, what I would call a free society? And the reality is there are a lot of visions out there. There's some socialists even who will try to argue that something similar to the Nordic model or something like that would be a good transition.
The Nordic model, though, is incredibly, I mean, capitalistic in any
it is.
meaningful sense. So. It's majority of it's essentially you just have corporations earn money, then are heavily taxed that support a generous welfare state, but the engine that drives the economy is still fundamentally capitalist in any meaningful sense.
Right, and though I'd argue that you can see right now we do have a lot of worker-run elements in our economy. Of course. Mm-hmm. Like I said, there are co-ops, and the reason co-ops don't do well, though, in a lot of ways, is because they have to compete with more predatory companies that are more willing to cut costs, including labor costs and things like that. In fact, of course, Mondragon is pretty famous for being a highly successful co-op run by workers. So maybe that could give us a start as to that sort of model.
I worked in a factory for about 3 years as an engineer, so, I mean, I don't think you've even begun to scratch the surface of the problems. Predatory doesn't really describe the difference between a well-run factory and a poorly run factory. I don't want to go on a huge, industrial engineering sidetrack here, but I mean the modern manufacturing processes are run in a customer-focused sense, and all of the proposed worker-focused things or worker-driven things would be driven by the needs of the worker, and I don't know how you'd compete on that sense. It wouldn't be necessarily predatory, right? Like, how would you avoid having overproduction or production of the wrong things, right, when the focus of the production was the worker and not the customer?
Right, and that is a really good question. And I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers to, well, how's this particular institution going to work? How are we going to, how are we going to structure X to be more efficient? But what I will say is that a lot of questions get raised about, well, how would you do without, say, a consumerist type economy, where people dictate their preferences in different ways? Let's say, why can't we have a democratically run economy where people dictate their preferences through and the data on those preferences is collected and used for production? And since
how would these preferences be communicated?
Well, that's the thing. It's not something I've mulled over in a lot of detail. So I can't tell you, well, here's how they're going to collect it, here's how it's going to be transmitted, here's who's going to sort it, and so forth, right?
Well, I have a... Oh, go ahead.
Sure. Like, for instance, there are different models. Participatory economics is a pretty popular model, and that's a socialist model that tries to kind of merge the best of what we have now with worker-run institutions. But I haven't read all of participatory economics, however interesting that might be. So, I mean, there are a variety of different models from all kinds of different socialists. Some that are in favor of, keeping currency and capital. Some are not. So I can't speak for all of them.
I have a question.
You to speak for your own opinions, so you don't have to be worried about speaking for some outside movement.
Right. Yeah, but what I'm saying is I really don't have that figured out, and that's really what I'm admitting. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Alex. You're talking about how large corporations now are able to outcompete cooperatives. Now, there are some things that cooperatives do rather well. Consumer co-ops are typically more successful than production co-ops, and there's many reasons for that. But is it possible? Now, a lot of times what libertarian socialists try to do is they'll try to find the currently existing form of worker control, whether it's Mondragon or in Mexico with the Zapatistas, or even more historical examples like the Spanish anarchists.
Right.
Now the thing is, though, one of the things that there's two questions. First of all, okay, let's admit that it's possible for worker-run companies to be successful, but is it possible that there's a division of labor within the economy itself, and that certain modes of necessary production are just not able to be met by worker control? Other modes might be, but certain modes might not. And then second of all, how would one if one wants to argue that all modes of production can be worker controlled, what tests would one have to show what tests would one have to perform to demonstrate that worker control would not be a valid means of production in this production line? So those two questions there.
Right, and I suppose to answer that, you'd have to look at, like I said, I do try to look at existing examples. Like if you look at Argentina and around Latin America, what you'll find is there are a lot of factory occupations that have happened that have been highly successful, where you've had workers take over factories and run them through worker control in a way that has not at all degenerated the work that's gone on there. And I think when you're talking about the division of labor, I'll admit that's a very difficult question, but one thing that I think has to be true to some degree is we have to have balanced job complexes. Now, what I mean when I say that is right now we have an economy where some people have disempowering work and others have empowering work for years on it. We have to have it so that everybody gets a share of the disempowering work and everybody gets a share of some kind of empowering work.
This seems to me to be a huge disagreement. I can't even imagine a world where that would be possible. Like, I mean, it's possible in some weird utopian way, but talking about alternatives to the corporation and worker control and more equitable distribution are things that I think are difficult but somewhat plausible. Talking about some system where the empowerment associated with work is equally distributed just strikes me as utopian.
Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be 100%.
Well, okay, for the first question, how do you even quantify that?
Well, like I said, I think that you can find jobs that people just across the board do not want to do, the dirty jobs that nobody wants, and then we try to equalize that and share that work. That way nobody's stuck doing exclusively just that over a long period of time.
But you're not taking into consideration that some people would prefer to have just like, a 7-hour dirty job and then just take a long weekend, right? Like, that's fine for them. And other people would work every minute of every day as long as that work was fulfilling. And it's not just those two people, it's an entire spectrum of preferences on that front, right?
Okay, well maybe we can, like I said, I'm not in favor of like a highly centralized system in the first place. So one of the reasons I'm really in favor of group community and individual autonomy is we can account for things like that. My main point is that people shouldn't be forced to do awful jobs for years on end that they don't want to be doing. That's my main point, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, hold on. There could be a distinction here, Alex. If people are you just saying that you don't want people to be economically forced into taking those jobs? Because I think we might be able to agree on that.
Yeah, I'm arguing that people shouldn't. If you look at a lot of if you look at capitalist work dissatisfaction, the engagement I read a Gallup poll from 2013. Engagement with jobs is astronomically low. It's 13% of people on a global scale describe themselves as engaged with their work, and I think that needs to change.
Your microphone's cutting out a little bit. Just maybe.
Excuse me, hold on. I think you misunderstood the question slightly, Alex. Let me just ask you this one question first. Do you think it's possible that some modes of production are not able to be met by collectively run factories? They just can't be done, and they're vital modes of production.
I don't think so, no.
So you don't think that's possible?
I have not seen any evidence that would lead me to believe that.
Now, I guess the second question then is, what would somebody have to show you to say that the production of this vital good cannot be produced through some sort of collective workers management? It has to be produced by some other system. Like, what would somebody have to demonstrate to show that?
I'd just like to know which example it is.
Well,
I can give you an example, Alex. If you want an example of, oh, sorry, Todd, did I interrupt you? I apologize.
No, that's all right. I was just going to say, almost every good that's produced as a heavy industry, like shipping, automobiles, airplanes, it's a notorious fact that worker-controlled production very seldom works. Most co-ops are consumer co-ops. The only one that I can think of that's not a consumer co-op is Mondragon. Production co-ops usually fail. And I don't necessarily know all the reasons for that, but if you want to produce shipping, automobiles, aircraft, trains, cooperatives have not been very successful in that regard.
I have some speculations as to why that's the case. From
go ahead,
an
David.
Engineering point of view. The reason why that's the case is that it's consumer focused, and that's why the consumer co-ops do so much better, is because the consumer co-ops are run by people who are sort of the end users, and so they can make demands on the supply chain, and they're sort of pulling the supply chain. Whereas modern manufacturing plants are a pull system, meaning that the consumer has to be in charge, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, no one cares. So, for instance, in chip manufacturing, which is where I worked, right, like in a blink of an eye, people decided suddenly that they wanted to have less chips for computers and more chips for phones. This caused like the entire factory to like shut down. People like pulled extra work. Like the entire thing retooled. It was so much extra work, right? But we did it because that's what the customers demanded, right? And if we took a vote in the factory, who wants to retool the factory to make this new product that we figure out that the consumers want? Nobody would have voted for that because that would have been more work, right?
And layoffs.
Well, not really layoffs. It's just a whole. I mean, perhaps layoffs if it were something, but the problem is once you run a factory for the people who are producing, and the product, is it all dynamic or all highly specific, which is most technical productions. I don't know, that it's just questionable how the how hard decisions that are impactful to the people who work there get made, right?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I've never seen a case where that's happened. I mean, mind you, I'm not familiar with that part of the literature.
I mean, I personally have witnessed this, and so has anyone who's ever worked in a modern factory.
But I still think that even in that case, there could be ways to find workarounds to, I mean, for instance, why does there need to be this radical division between workers and consumers when they could be the same thing, right? Like, and for instance, too, right? If we
I'm sorry, Alex. Can you check your microphone one more time? We fixed it once, and but it's kind of going back to this fuzzy thing. Are you hearing this too, Todd?
Yeah, I can hear it too.
Yeah, I just check it one more time. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure you're clear in your answer so we can both hear you.
Is it better now?
I think it's better now. Yeah,
Okay.
When you adjust it gets better.
All right. So what I'm getting at is that there are ways to help ameliorate this. So, in other words, and I'd argue that yes, there needs to be a way for everybody to agree that whenever workers and their communities, which is everybody, express their demands, that those demands then reflect production. So I agree on that. On the other hand, there are other tactics too for reducing the load everybody has to carry, and I would argue that includes eliminating corporate bureaucracy and a lot of bureaucratic and unneeded jobs from the economy. So that way, what we can do is we can use surplus labor to lighten everybody's load, and we can also try to focus on developing technology to take over production work for us as much as possible.
Do you think that the problem is? Oh, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, there was something I was going to say about sort of collective, a communal property arrangement and production. There's one thing that I've noticed, and it doesn't often show up in the literature, is that when you look at communes that are specifically theological and communes that are specifically secular, the secular communes almost invariably fail, and the ones that are not, the religious ones succeed. The classic test case is New Harmony. From 1814 to 1825, New Harmony was run by a community of pietist Lutherans called the Rappists, led by a man named Jen Rapp. And he was kind of a mystic. And they were essentially a commune, and they produced lumber, and it was quite profitable. But he claimed he had a vision from God that he was going to leave, so he sold it off to Owen, who was one of the early socialists of the 19th century, one of the utopian socialists. And they ran New Harmony for like 2 years, and then it completely went bankrupted, and everybody just couldn't get along. And Owen's son said, you can't expect people to work if you remunerate the people that don't work equally with the people that do. And we can look at, say, the monastic order. I don't know if you know this, but some people have speculated that right prior to the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, that certain Catholic monasteries were on the verge of mass production of steel. Have you heard of that?
Surprised. I have heard that before.
And we also have in Western Canada the Hutterite communities, which in many ways they do mirror the left libertarian view of private property and private property. So they have this personal effects, it's theirs, and then the rest of it's owned by the community. And they're actually quite profitable in agribusiness. So the thing is, if you look at those, they work very well. The monastic system has been working for 1,700 years since, St. Anthony. And, the Hutterites have been essentially a communist religious commune for 500 years, and they've been very successful at what they do. But if we look at, like, secular examples, like New Harmony, I think there was the Oneida community, there was the kibbutzim, which the kibbutzim is entirely privatized now. They don't really believe in socialism anymore. They don't work. And I feel like there's an element there that is not looked at. With the critics of collective production, they see the secular failures, but they don't look at the success stories within the monastic system, various Christian communitarian systems, like for instance, the Hutterites, as I mentioned, but there are others. Or the
what you're talking about here is the incredible power of culture and ethical systems to allow people to work in very, very hard situations against perhaps what would be better offers from the outside because of the ethical and cultural connections they have to other people in the community. And this is something, I think this is a critical dimension that's left out of discussions of solutions, right, to these problems.
Well, I think it's interesting, if I may, that we do have some examples of non-religious groups successfully cooperating and producing what's necessary and having a whole host of other benefits while they're at it. Peasant commons in Europe, and especially London, for instance, had a notoriously short...
Sorry, I don't interrupt, but could you just try the microphone one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure, it's a new one, but...
Yeah. It just breaks up a lot, and it gets good for a while and then goes back. But keep on going. You were saying?
Okay. So I was saying, if you look at, for instance, the peasant commons in England, they had a famously short work year that worked extraordinarily well. Or if you look at as
Are you talking about the diggers?
No, I'm talking about I've just started reading about them, but they were shut down by force by the English government that basically outlawed self-sufficiency through game and hunting laws and a lot of other laws they passed. And the nobles united with the capitalists to shut down these peasant commons that had common production.
Okay, but were they really secular? I mean, this sounds like it was in the early modern era.
Well, maybe not totally secular, but no society is totally secular. You're just not going to have that.
But I think this is the point, though, right? Oftentimes, peasant communities, and you'll often see this in hunter and gatherer communities too, right? A hunter and gatherer community share an incredibly lot more than any post-farming, post-agricultural, or post-industrial society does. And they're able to enforce sharing norms through a very, very powerful common culture and very, very powerful familial bonds, when you talk about peasant economies, you're talking about groups of people who are all very closely related in terms of beliefs and in kinship too, right? Oftentimes peasants would call each other kinsmen.
All right, so let's talk about examples. Go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing, Dave, though, is there are specifically secular atheist examples. We have New Harmony with Owen, and we have the Spanish anarchists. And these are explicitly atheist experiments, as was, I think, well, I don't know if the Oneida community was explicitly atheist, but it was certainly explicitly anti-Christian, because they practiced free love, and that didn't work so well at Oneida. And what I'm saying is these explicitly secular, are there some successes? Yes. The Cuban scene worked for about 40 years. But what I mean is that's a drop in the bucket compared to the monastic system or Christian communitarian systems like the Hutterites. Over the long run, the internal contradictions of collective production break them down much sooner than they do in self-consciously religious institutions like the monastery is really the best example, because everything is collectively owned within the monastery except for the personal effects of their clothes and maybe their toothbrush. Mm-hmm. And it's been working since St. Anthony, 1,700 years ago. That's quite an impressive track record. And I find it very surprising that socialists never bother to study the monastic system for hints and examples of why does it work. Like, they seem to understand how, they seem to make collective production work. Would you agree with that, Dave? I mean, up to a point.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would actually say this kind of augments my theory that what makes sort of collective production and ownership work well are these very, very high trust societies that have a bunch of familial blood, religion, and cultural bounds in common, and therefore they're able to both have common objectives common amongst each other, and also they're able to self-enforce norms that allow them to have and organize more effectively. Which is why I always say that culture is so important. We can't discuss, perhaps this is something that me and Todd both agree with, but we can't discuss economics separate from the culture that the economics exist in, right? And that's another mistake I think we make a lot.
Well, you can think about it even with capitalism, right? It works very well in the Anglosphere, but if you were to import it to Africa, it hasn't worked very well.
Yeah, I mean, you'd expect any economic system to work differently in different cultures. They would have common, I mean, there would be a cultural effect, I should say, right? I don't expect, some things are just bad ideas and they never work anywhere, right? But I would be cautious of that. Sorry, Alex, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to argue that, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and mechanical solidarity is something that's been observed a lot already, and that it really helps to have communal.
Have you tried? Sorry, Alex. Have you tried unplugging the USB and plugging it back in again? I mean, that might be. I hate to constantly harp on about this.
But it is pretty bad, Dave. I mean, it's just like it's hard to hear him.
I'm having a hard time hearing him. It's going to be even hard because, like his decibel range, like his bandwidth range and yours are of the opposite side. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, well, we're going to hear Alex's rebuttal, but I guess to me it seems like attempts to manufacture these things have been very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there's really three kinds of socialism: utopian socialism, state socialism, and anarchism. Utopian socialism was a universal failure. The most egregious failure was New Harmony. State socialism was an egregious failure, and we saw that in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And really, anarchism never got off the ground.
Well, I mean, the thing is, anarchism has all these details you need to work out that, that make it very, very difficult to. I mean, we'll hear Alex's rebuttal when he reinstalls his microphone or whatever.
Sure.
It looks like he's still having some trouble. But I think that here's where we would want to transition the conversation into perhaps cultural questions, right?
Can I bring up some real quick?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
No, this is about transitioning. Oh, he dropped again. You want to re-invite him?
Okay. I mean, I didn't re-invite him last time, but I think he'll just re-enter, hopefully. Okay, there we go.
So here's while we're waiting for him. Yeah. One thing I like to transition to is the issues of men in the modern age. Oh, no, he's back.
Okay, great. So let's hear his rebuttal, and then we can transition to the cultural things. Okay, sorry, Alex. You were about to say.
Right, I was going to agree that, what's called by,
Still can't hear
it's
this.
called by,
Alex, you're really breaking
Maybe you
up
could
really
turn the
bad.
video off. Would that help?
yeah,
If you're having a bandwidth problem, that might help.
yeah, I probably am. Just for the internet connection, my apologies.
Yeah, I totally can't hear him at all. Can you,
I can't
Dave?
hear. I can't hear anything. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna put a pin in that. Oh, I'm gonna put a pin in that, and then how about Todd? You go on about. We're gonna transition now to sort of cultural problems, perhaps, and then we'll come back in for Alex for his rebuttal once we can hear him again.
Yeah. So one of the things that I had this theory on for a while is there's, as you know, in the alternative right, there's what's called the manosphere, and they like to discuss men's issues, which pretty much for them boils down to getting laid. But
yeah, among the pickup artist guys, especially.
Now, here's what I think, though. There is one of the biggest problems with men that I see a men's issue is this. Aristotle wrote in the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics that friendship, and by friendship I mean the third and highest level of friendship, the love of one's soul, is what keeps society together. He says explicitly in the Politics that, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect that men bound together in a fraternity of love create, or a fraternity of friendship, which is love of their soul, love of the virtue of the other individual, is what makes a viable society, a viable state. And the other thing is,
I wish. See, you know what the problem is right now, Todd, is I totally agree with you. I think Alex totally wouldn't.
I know. I wish he was here.
All I'm going to tell you, all I'm going to say is like, oh, you're right.
No, but see, but hold on, Dave. Here's the thing, though. Okay, what does a tyrant fear? A tyrant does not fear a prostitute. A tyrant does not fear a slave. What a tyrant fears is a free man bound together with other free men in a fraternity of love. That's what he fears. And you know what? They've attacked that because there's two angles of this attack. There's two vectors of this attack, at least: feminism and homosexuality. Feminism attacks it because anytime men organize together for whatever reason, a debate club, a golf club, somehow it's the Ku Klux Klan all over again. And we have to break up, and women have to batter their way in. Oh, they're discriminating. Women are not allowed in this club. Well, there's women's clubs that don't allow men. Why can't there be men's clubs? I mean, for instance, look at the American Revolution. Where did it start? It started in a pub with Sam Adams and John Hancock, and they got chased out of the pub by the British. And that led to that skirmish that had the shot heard around the world. So these men were engaging in masculine men activities, going to the pub, talking politics. They would go to the pub not to get laid, but to talk about politics. And they're afraid of that. And so how does the tyrant solidify control? Well, he essentially cuckolds the man.
He creates the hollow state where there are nothing between the individual and the forceful application of might at the highest level.
As Aristotle also said, the tyrant empowers women and slaves because the tyrant has no fear of women and slaves, and they have a good time under the tyrant. And so the men that might rise up and overthrow the tyrant are themselves cuckolded by their own women and children and slaves, because the state is more powerful than any individual. And if they elevate women, slaves, and children in a way to overrule their masters, fathers, and husbands, then they'll be afraid, because the state will jump on you as soon as you confront the woman, the child, or the slave. And so as soon as that happens, the state jumps on you and you're toast. You can't even organize to rebel the state. And so Aristotle tells us the tyrant directly attacks masculine fraternities because they're a threat to their power. The other thing is homosexuality does the same thing. All male relationships are sexualized. Frodo and Sam are homosexuals. David and Jonathan.
We can implicitly do this, certainly, because we know that homosexuality was rather accepted in Aristotle's time. So it has to be some modern manifestation of this.
Well, and technically, Epaminondas and Pelopidas were homosexual lovers, but they joined together to overthrow Sparta.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
right.
Exactly. No, you're right. But the way homosexuality is used today.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something. There's a little. I think we're more truth there, right?
No, I would not. You're right. Historically, you can't say homosexuality always does this. It obviously didn't in ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, those men were very masculine, aggressive warrior types, like the Spartans and the Thebans. But today, though, by trying to sexualize male relationships, I mean, men are uncomfortable when you say, "Oh, did you sleep with that guy the other night?"
Mm-hmm.
Most men are straight. Therefore, most men are uncomfortable at that implication. So to avoid the charge of being homosexual, what do these men do? They just don't have friendships with other men. And what you do...
I think we might have lost Alex. I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I just noticed this.
No, I know. I don't know what happened. But here's the thing, though.
Having a really bad connection, right? It's too bad because this is where we could get the real clash going, right?
Here's the thing. I think you and I would agree with this. Free men bound together in love are the only thing that keep tyrants up in bed at night.
Yeah, that's a dangerous thing, right? That is,
and that's why feminism and homosexuality are tools by the tyrant to keep us slaves.
I agree with you that there's a problem in both of those movements in the modern day. The question is whether we're talking about something implicit to those two things, or whether we're talking about something that's a specific product of our times when it comes to conduct.
As regards to homosexuality, it's not intrinsic to it, as we know in ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
You might say the same thing about feminism too. You could restructure it in a way that might not be so.
Here's where I think that's not the case, because feminism is the result of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And you don't have
but so is democracy, though, too, right?
But that's the same problem. Democracy has the same problem. You see, anything that was born in the French Enlightenment, or even the English Enlightenment for that matter, all of these things are fundamentally corrosive to traditional societies. And the inherent values, I don't remember which pope it was, but there was a 19th century pope that said, "The liberal was the cry of Lucifer, I will not obey."
That sounds like Pope Pius X.
And so
sounds like I can't say for certain, obviously.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
But Pope Pius X was a huge opponent of liberalism, and he was at the later part of the 19th century.
Well, exactly. But what I'm saying is, we have accounts of homosexuals long before the modern age, and again, they were not inhibiting the formation of these male fraternities. In fact, in the ancient Greek world, there was an obvious sexual element to those male fraternities, as we saw with the Sacred Band.
Yeah, but you also see that active female leaders participate throughout history, and there's no problem caused by that whatsoever, right? It's just
but you also know that many of those are exceptions. Zenobia, Boudica, these are not Deborah. These women rise up in a crisis situation where there's a lack of male leadership. You don't have a consistent pressure throughout the ancient or medieval world where you say, you know what, let's just surreptitiously bring women into this field. And
I might contest the whole thing that anything that comes out of the Enlightenment, though, is going to be poisoned. I mean, it's true that these ideas have problems with them, but I don't see that their description during the Enlightenment makes them irredeemable by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, let's put it this way. In one sense, you're correct that an idea, no matter what its source, could have some virtue. Basil the Great once said that a Christian should be like a hummingbird flitting from flower to flower, sucking the nectar of knowledge from every source. I agree with that. But some things are born bad. I mean, I think you and I would agree that Marxism was just born bad.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said.
I would argue that feminism was just born bad. It's like Marxism. You can't. It'd be a waste of time trying to redeem Marxism. I mean, why would you try? Anything good that I'd say could easily be supplied by some alternative explanation. And
I agree. I mean, what do you mean by feminism? I mean, feminism is depending on your definition of feminism. I either wholeheartedly embrace it or wholeheartedly
Okay. Well, let's see. When it comes to third wave feminism, I think we'd agree on that it's completely crazy.
Yeah, from my definitions of third wave feminism, that is correct. The movement
second wave feminism.
Third wave feminism is essentially Marxism with proletariat crossed out and women written in, and bourgeoisie crossed out and men written in.
Exactly. Now, second wave feminism would have been the suffragette movement of the 1920s, right? That would be the second wave feminism?
I thought that was still first wave, but I could be wrong.
Well, then what would second wave be? The bra burners of the 60s?
No, second wave would be women in going to the workforce and increasing numbers.
Okay, so feminists like Betty... So feminists like Betty Friedan
Friedan would be a second wave.
Well, these people are not so. She said that a woman in a household was like a Jew in a concentration camp.
I think Betty Friedan was probably she was technically herself a second wave feminist, aka she didn't really want to upset everything, but she used evocative language that essentially kicked off the third wave feminist movement.
And then you also have Simone de Beauvoir, the wife of
when they talked with each other, I think Betty Friedan was horrified by Simone de Beauvoir, right?
Yeah, but I think you and I would both be horrified by the solutions proposed by Beauvoir or Friedan.
Beauvoir was essentially, she was one of these radicals that comes from like that, Sartrean like French school, right? I mean, it's not surprising.
Okay. Now, okay, so we've got, I think you and I would both agree that second and third wave feminism is seriously problematic.
Yeah.
Now, he's back.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
Alex is back.
Okay, thank you. See, we were just having this thing where we were agreeing too much, and I'm like, oh no, this is terrible. It's turning into an echo chamber.
So hold on a second. Alex, did you get to hear our discussion about masculinity?
Okay.
I just say that my connection killed my audio quality, so I apologize in advance.
Okay, let's hope it evens out a little bit. Let's give it some time. Do we have to rehash that part about the
men? Well, let me ask him real quick. Alex, did you hear our discussion about masculinity and tyranny?
Probably not, but have you considered cutting the video if you're having bandwidth problems, which it sounds like you're having?
Yeah, let me see if I can. Is that any better?
Yeah,
that's so much better. Oh, okay, great.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so did you listen in on the?
No, I was fiddling, trying to figure things out.
Okay, do you want me to give a really brief? Do you want me to give a really brief overview to Alex about masculinity?
Okay. Well. Yeah. So we were disagreeing on something. But Todd, could you briefly make your point, and then I'll summarize my counterpoint, and then Alex can obviously. This is something we're certainly going to disagree on.
Well, okay. Well, we're talking about feminism last, but let's back it up to what led us to that point.
Mm-hmm.
I was making the point, Alex, today that one of the serious problems facing men in general, and specifically in society at large today, is the undermining of masculine fraternities and friendships. So Aristotle writes in the Politics that friendship, well, he first defines friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, and there's three levels: utility, pleasure, and love of virtue. And love of virtue is the highest, purest form of friendship. And he says in the Politics that free men bound together in the bonds of love and friendship are the glue that creates a society in a stable state. And he says that tyrants are afraid of that bond of men working together. And so he says that women and slaves, we can argue in our age, children, are empowered at the expense of men to cuckold them so that they're afraid to organize against the tyrant.
Did Aristotle actually use the word cuckold?
No. I'm using it because it's a common term now.
Okay. Well, we'll put an asterisk behind that.
Okay. The men are emasculated. How about that? They're emasculated by these forms of empowerment. And he mentions other modes, building projects with the pyramids or going to wars against blaming other people for your problems, but fundamentally attacking these masculine friendships. And in the modern age, there's at least two vectors of attack. We see one vector of attack through feminism, one vector of attack through homosexuality. So with feminism, any purely male institution is going to be attacked, and they will say it must include women. Whereas
okay,
women are allowed to
make the critique very quick because we want to get a response, okay?
Oh, sure, sorry. Yeah. And then the other thing is homosexuals in the modern world, by sexualizing male relationships, make it less likely for other men to build friendships with other men, because most men are straight. Most men would find it uncomfortable to be implied that their best friend and them are having homosexual relationships.
Sure.
And what that does is it weakens any possible resistance to state tyranny. And the only successful resistance to state tyranny has been by free men bound together in fraternity of friendship and love, as we saw in the ancient world with the overthrow of the Tarquins.
Okay, so I think that's the basic critique is this, that Aristotle said that you need to have organizations of men in order to essentially counterbalance a tyrannical force. I would disagree that feminism and homosexuality are implicitly detracting from this. I'd say perhaps there could be a problem there, but I'm sure Alex disagrees with this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, but because I would say earlier what you were saying about economics, yeah, I can see that point. That's definitely a critique to consider. But here, I'd argue that feminism, so this is a very common way of looking at like certain, especially when it comes to social justice warriors.
Can you define what you mean by social justice warriors? I'm sorry to always hark on definitions, but
sure, yeah, that's a good idea. But what I mean is sort of like uninformed feminism, one might say.
Okay, certainly.
Yeah. So when it comes to uninformed feminism, you do have some people saying, that will say, well, we just need a simple ratio. That's where there's more women to men in X institution. And I'm not sure I always agree with that, because that's not always that's not always an indication that there is sexism in something. You have to really support that analytically.
Can I ask you a question, Alex, that's more to
Sure.
the point?
Yeah.
Do you think it's implicitly wrong to have organizations that are dedicated to one sex or the other?
No, I don't think
Okay,
so. And I'm a feminist.
Hypothetically, we could have fraternal organizations.
Yeah, what's the problem with that? I don't see an issue.
A lot of people do have problems with that, right?
Uh,
A lot of people do have problems because they see it as exclusionary, right?
Yeah, but you could argue for that from either side. I mean, women.
For
men
instance, the Boy Scouts got critiqued for being only male. A variety of institutions, I think including the Freemasons, got critiqued about this, but I don't think they've caved yet on that. Todd, did you have anything in mind when you were talking about fraternal organizations?
Well, I'm thinking of the classic characters of for instance, Plutarch's Noble Lives, where we read about Polypes, the Theban revolutionary who overthrew the Spartans with the aid of Epaminondas, his lover as well as friend. So in that case, ancient Greek homosexuality was not a hindrance to this kind of relationship.
It was actually usually introduced as a facilitator of that very relationship.
Yeah, whereas today I don't see that. But
yeah, it's kind of a contrast between how we conceptualize homosexuality in today's society versus.
But also in ancient Rome with the Tarquins, when Tarquin raped Brutus's wife, Brutus and all of his other noble friends were able to organize and revolt against the Tarquins and throw them out of Rome.
Yes.
And also when Sparta.
So, but Todd, the point I was asking is, which sorry. You said that there was. You said I have seen instances where people calling themselves feminists have said it is illegitimate to have organizations dedicated to one gender or the other.
Well, for instance, VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, was an all-male institute until the feminists forced them to integrate.
Okay, so there are examples, and I can think of examples too, right? There have been numerous examples of male organizations forced to integrate. But for instance, even restrooms, right? I know that in the city I live in, restroom integration is a huge deal. I guess that's more for the transgender purposes than it is for purposes of feminism. But still, I guess it's a similar argument could be made, right?
Uh-huh.
Alex, do you believe that that sexes need to have spaces that are exclusively one sex, or that's a productive thing to have in society?
It's an interesting question. I'd say it would depend on the particular community it's in. I mean, I don't think that there's a necessity somewhere in the universe that says yes, they need it. But if people want to form that, I really don't see an issue.
I think the perfect example. A lot of more progressive Catholics, I'm a Catholic myself, are constantly lobbying for getting rid of the all-male priesthood. Something that I theologically don't see any basis for. I don't see any basis for having female priests, I should say. But that's been a constant push from sort of, I guess you could say, quote-unquote feminists, whatever that word means. I never know what that word means. That's so. I would say that I would say that certainly there seem like there are some organizations that are necessarily all male or all female, and that is really required in order to make them work.
Huh.
Well, let me bring something up. Alex, you mentioned.
I could take it. Alex's response really quickly before you bring another topic in, because I'm trying to figure out, because to me it's really rare. Like, so there are a lot of arguments against having female priests in the Catholic Church, but whenever they're made, a common feminist counterpoint is it's just unethical to have a certain organization that's exclusively dedicated towards men, or to women for that matter. I guess if only implicitly. So am I to understand that you do not embrace that point of view?
No, and I think it's a thorny issue. Because it is bound up with a lot of history. When you look at the priesthood, a lot of it has. There have been a lot of very. It's generally associated with sexism, and so there's a revulsion.
Okay, but hold on a second here. So, are you making the case that there are some organizations that can legitimately be all male? The priesthood just is not one of them.
No, I'm just pointing out that there's.
So you're saying that. But does that mean that you're saying that there can be legitimate all-male organizations, or there can't?
I think there can be, absolutely.
No, he said there can be, so he would agree that in principle. But I think you'd say, Alex, right, that an all-male organization, if it becomes sexist, would have to be restructured, right?
Let me say this. All I'm saying here, and all I'm saying is that I can understand the revulsion a lot of feminists have towards a lot of these traditional all-male organizations that tend to be sexist.
However, the revulsion.
Yeah. However, on principle, I really don't see a problem with all-male organizations that want to keep it that way either.
Okay. Well, I want to bring up something now.
I thought that'd be an area of disagreement.
This is the point that I'm getting at, though. Not your position, but Alex. But when you said that feminists would call it sexist, see, this is where the cry of sexism is itself a form of oppression. By attacking male institutions.
Todd, can you just like I asked Alex what his definition of oppression is? What do you mean by oppression? Okay. That word is so loaded. I just really have to ask for definitions every time I hear it.
I'll use it in the classical sense. In ancient Greece and Rome and the medieval Christendom, oppression was unwarranted state interference. So a tyrant would be like Xerxes, a guy that could just levy taxes whenever he wanted, could conscript your children and to fight his wars whenever he wanted. We
need to make a very clear distinction at this point in the conversation, because under Alex's definition of oppression, almost everyone in modern-day society is oppressed. But under Todd's definition of oppression, almost no one in modern-day society is oppressed.
Well, exactly, because I'm using the classical definition of oppression.
I just have to be really clear about the total difference between those two senses of the word.
But what I'm saying is, though, by attacking male institutions, which feminists do all the time, you're removing the natural, organic white blood cells that fight tyranny. Because tyrants never stay up at night worrying about organized bodies of women, prostitutes, transsexuals, pimps, or any of these groups. The only groups that they fear that keep them up at night are organized bodies of free men, which is why they constantly argue for the disarmament of men and the destruction of all male societies.
But hold on, is there a disagreement here, though? Like, I think Alex said that he did think there was some legitimate all-male organizations, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so, but do you see, Alex, how people that undermine those all-male organizations, not saying that you do, but the people that do that, are in fact facilitating the power of tyrant, because the tyrant's natural opponents are no longer able to organize against him.
I agree with your principle of association, by organizational association, but I have to say that I think your implications are a bit flawed here. And the reason being is that I'm trying, women are a potent force for, I would argue, even revolutionary efforts at times. Mm-hmm. Now, the people who hold power may not think that, but they also, and I remember an anecdote from a professor in a Roman history class I took, where where there was an aristocrat and I can't remember the exact, there are two people in power were talking, right? And one of the slaves went to one of the powerful people, and he said, "There's a slave revolt that's going to happen." And one of the rulers said, "Well, how can that happen?" And the slave said, "Look around you. Nearly everyone is a slave here. And they all have, implements of some kind. They're carrying around like metal implements. But people in power oftentimes don't see threats because they consider those people subjugated and docile. But I don't think women are not a threat. I don't think it's just men that are a threat. Absolutely not."
Well, let me rephrase it. You are correct about slaves. The Romans had numerous slave revolts: Spartacus, the Servile War, right, the Sicilian Grain Revolt. So those were legitimate, and the Romans did fear that. And also the southern slaveholders feared a slave revolt after the genocide of the white population in Haiti in 1805 when they were all massacred.
There's also like Nat Turner, or who is that? Nat Turner was the person who had that unsuccessful slave revolt in the South.
Yes,
right?
but
John
the thing
Brown.
was, though, the persistent fear was what happened in Haiti. And
right.
so,
yes.
They have identified that. But as far as women, if you look at the history of revolutions beginning, I don't know what the earliest one would be, we could agree on, but they're not led by women. I mean, the Roman Empire wasn't overthrown by women.
But hold on. I just want to say, for before we get into like whether men or women in organizations are a threat to state power, to me, the bigger problem is that there's just fewer organizations, period, in modern day, right? If you look at the modern person in society, men or women, they join fewer organizations. They're not members of churches. They don't have social life outside of their work and their consumption habits, right?
That's true.
Certainly, so this would be what?
So this is the bowling alone argument,
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to mention. You preemptively quoted Putnam, which is. Yeah. But that's a huge problem, and I think that phenomenon is really what's driving this falling away of fraternal orders, like you were saying, Todd, right?
Well, you're correct in that, but I don't see the government going out of its way to attack all female institutions. Or, for that matter, all black institutions. I mean, if you had a white caucus, they'd scream bloody murder.
Yeah, sure.
But a black caucus is okay. So
you're right, there isn't an organized body of people who would bring lawsuits against exclusively a female. Yeah, but I think that, I don't know, to me, it just seems like it's carried away by a larger phenomenon of people not organizing as much anymore, I guess.
No, I would agree with that in principle, but what I'm saying is, why are they attacking institutions that are self-evidently male and white? Because they perceive them as threats.
I can explain this.
Sure. Go ahead, Alex, please.
So I'll admit here, the feminist movement has its share of problems, and one of those is sometimes double standards that creep into the movement, as critiques that I think are directed the wrong way. Now, you've noted that there are all male organizations and there are all white organizations that do get attacked. And the reason for this is because a lot of these organizations, historically speaking, a lot of organizations that were either all male or all white represented forms of either state or social dominance against black folks or women. Mm-hmm. Now, is that the case today? Not necessarily. As you pointed out, there are legitimate reasons that men can get together in fraternal organizations, and I've got no beef with that. But some people do, and I think they still overreact some whenever they see, oh no, there's an organization that's all men. Yeah, well, they turn into attack.
It seems like there's a lot of disagreement here, right? I mean,
well, hold on a second. I would agree that they tend to overreact, but you see, there's another double standard too, because historically, if you look at Africa, when you have self-identified black organizations like the ANC, they oppress not just the white inhabitants of Africa, but also the colors, which would be the Indians that were imported as coolies, and then the mixed groups.
Perhaps a better example might be Idi Amin.
Or even Rhodesia with Mugabe. Nobody criticizes the ZANU, which is an all-black organization based on terrorism, murder, and extortion. And it was an all-black organization.
I would say ZANU got criticized fairly heavily in the last 15 years. Perhaps not at first.
Not during the 70s and 80s when it was overthrowing the Ian Smith government. Not then. It was only after they took over.
I don't know about. I mean, it got criticized in '97 onward.
Oh, sure. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about when it was actually.
I can explain that too, though. Yeah. There's a good explanation for all of that, and and I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, sure. I mean, no. This is a back and forth. Please do.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a good explanation, which is that, and this is just me. I wasn't even aware of those two instances. When a lot of feminists focused on what happens in America, and that's the scope of their knowledge. If you look outside of that, they're not going to be familiar, really, if they're not studying that, they're probably not going to be familiar with it. Popular consciousness is pretty limited, generally speaking. So I'd argue that what you're looking at is the limitations of knowledge, especially when you're talking about sort of entry-level feminists who maybe have a very minimal knowledge of theory and application.
Well, there's two things to look at this. First of all, the harping on the really non-existent patriarchy in the West, with the real sexual exploitation of women in the Middle East, especially after
you know that as soon as you talk about patriarchy, I'm going to ask you for a definition of patriarchy.
Me? Well, I'm saying that
anybody actually. Hold on. Actually, I've got a question, Alex. Alex, do you believe in patriarchy?
Well, I guess. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there are definitely.
Oh, hold on. Can you check your microphone one more time? We're getting the same problem. Sorry.
Okay.
I apologize. I asked you a bomb question, and then I'm like,
is this good?
That's much better.
Okay. I'll try to keep a little closer here, but I would say yes, I do agree in patriarchy.
And that would be.
All right. So I would define patriarchy as a system where men are. I'm trying to think of how to precisely define this here, but.
Do you mind if I give the typical definition? As far as I understand patriarchy from the feminist perspective, patriarchy I understand to be this. It's a system where, well, it's on the one hand a system of male domination and oppression where the interests of men are pursued to the exclusion of women, but in another sense, it's the fact that men are in a privileged position that they believe is unwarranted, that men can get away with things that women can't precisely because they're men. It's analogous to white privilege, according to the leftist critique. Whites can do things because they're white, and it's not earned, it's not rewarded. So for them, patriarchy is this idea that men are in power and dominate women. That's the more visceral version of it. But that's
do you agree with that definition, Alex?
Actually, that's pretty on spot. Yeah.
Okay.
I've followed the left for a while, so I can give, I think, pretty good definitions of what they'd say.
So do you understand the common traditionalist counter-critique to this? I don't know exactly how much you followed the right, but...
I will say that I am completely new to the traditionalist right.
Okay, so, I mean, the common critique of this, if you go to any right-wing movement, is that essentially it's sort of ahistorical, because privilege was not out. It was true that men and women had different roles, and that both men and women were penalized for breaking those roles. But if you look historically, it is not clear that the male role, on average or in median, was somehow more privileged than the female role. And if you go back in history to, prior to the Industrial Revolution, a sort of equalization of gender roles would have been ridiculous, right? And in some ways was necessary.
Hold on, real quick, Dave. I want to kind of finish the point that when I said patriarchy, I meant just that when I defined it. And what I'm saying is patriarchy in America doesn't exist. It exists in the Middle East where women are being brutalized. And
but can we just get Alex's response to that point really
Sure.
quickly? Because if we go back to your hello.
Yeah. Am I good on the microphone?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
I guess I can hear you a little bit. It's still a little bit rough. But so that critique it criticizes like saying that if you go back to 1800, your average man was more privileged than your average woman, or could be noticeably put in a position of privilege for the most part, is just totally ahistorical.
Well, I would argue, how do you measure that privilege, and how do you measure? Like, I'm not saying that you're wrong, right? I don't know enough about
The theory postulates some privilege that men had as a group, right?
Well,
That's what the theory postulates, and you agreed to that theory. So what privilege
Sure.
did you have in mind?
Well, I would argue if we look at the logical places to start are the categories of economic, social, and political. From a political standpoint, in the 19th and 20th, or most of the 20th century, women didn't have much in the way of even any voice to speak politically.
But notice that I said 1800. But at any time prior to 200 years ago.
Well, I mean, if you look at a lot, like, and this is evident in Roman plays, and I'm trying to remember the one I read, but
Okay.
women are frequently compared to animals and seen as crafty. And
I've read a bunch of Greek and Roman plays, and I can say that that's not entirely true. But look, this is not the case. You said that women did not have political power, but men didn't have political power before 1800 for the most part either, anywhere, right?
Only a few men did, the royalty and the nobility.
Yeah.
And
So I mean, this is where the critique starts coming in, right? Men as a group had power. Like it starts getting a little bit ridiculous, right? Like.
Well, I mean, the classic example is the poor, unemployed white guy sleeping on the street and the rich white female CEO. I mean,
let's focus. Let's focus this on the example I gave.
Okay.
Just all of human existence prior to 1800, which is 99.99% of patriarchy, right?
Mhm.
that's a fair bit of it, but I'd still argue that, I mean, how can you look at the sort of sexist attitudes in Greece and Rome, where women were considered practically nothing? And you can see this in a lot.
But what you're saying, sexist attitudes among specific Roman playwrights, I'm talking about, like, for the mainstay of society. Like, for the mainstay of society, men and women got up at dawn, they both worked, women in the home and men in the fields typically, or hunting. They both came back, had probably a brief break and a meal, and they went to sleep. And that was their existence. Mortality rates were higher, much higher among men, through all periods of history prior to 1800, right? And for all but a fraction of people, right?
No, I would, okay, so a few points to make. I mostly, when it comes to antiquity, I've mostly studied Greek and Roman history.
We're not talking about antiquity. We're talking about all history prior to 200 years ago.
Well, that's a huge generalization.
No, I'm talking about a much. Alex, my critique is very broad.
Right.
I'm talking about all human existence prior to the Industrial Revolution.
No, hold on. Can I try to clarify this?
Sure.
I think what Dave is trying to ask you is, what to you would constitute privilege? That men having privilege as a class, and then he would want to argue that whatever you come up with would only apply to a few men at the top of any social pyramid at any point in time. So whatever privilege you claim that men as a group would have would only be applied to a very few men, and would therefore break down the further back in time you go as the franchise was narrower and narrower.
And then even at the top, right, would you be comparing Augustus Caesar to Livia, right? Even then, the difference is very small, right? Like the.
Well,
So I don't understand how the.
Well, hold on. Even in the ancient world, a queen or a princess would have far more rights and privileges than a male peasant working in the field.
Well, no, Todd. Let's just compare likes to likes, right?
Okay.
No CEOs to just say likes to likes, right? It just the overall effect of patriarchy in the system just seems to be so minimal for the most part, right?
Okay, so that's his claim. How would you? I think I've clarified Dave's claim.
Yeah, thank you. That was a clarification, Todd. Thank you. That was good. Yeah, but just comparing likes to likes in any scale of human history, this perspective doesn't seem to. It seems to be a very poor model. I'll say that.
So what would you say, Alex?
I mean, as someone who is a feminist, what I look to is specific systems and I look at specific societies. I mean, it's an interesting critique. I'm not going to say it's wrong because I've not considered it before, and I can't, analyze it in the short.
You have not considered the fact that men had an incredible amount of hardship before 1800.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I've known that obviously, but I've never heard it put the way you've put it. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I've never heard that argument.
And let me clarify specifically. Alex, by your definition of oppression as things that constrain how you want to live your life, you are absolutely right that women had things that constrained how they wanted to live their lives all throughout human history. But you're ignoring the fact that almost every single man had the same thing. So it looks like a big conspiracy of men against women if you only look at the systems that were constraining women. But when you look at the system altogether, the patriarchy theory kind of falls apart.
Well, I'd argue that, and again, this is just me knowing certain parts of history, that if you look at legal rights and if you look at economic rights, there are clearly advantages to being a man for a lot of antiquity in many different cultures and societies.
How about this, Alex? But compare that though. So you're right that men had. Okay, first of all, when you say rights, you're only talking essentially about the last 200 years and not prior to 1800. Right?
Dave, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
What I was going to say was this. Okay, now, Alex, from what I understand, you're saying that, well, historically, men were able to own property, were able to be juries in a court. Well, women weren't, and that's a form of inequality where why wouldn't women be allowed to own property in their own name? Why wouldn't women be allowed to be jurors on a court to give testimony?
Right. Political participation.
In that sense, that's privilege. But you see, here's the thing. There was a cost to that women didn't have to bear. Women didn't die on the battlefield being ripped to shreds by sabers and cannonballs. Women didn't have to die breaking their backs in the farm. So, yes, there was a privilege that they had, but they also had a responsibility. In fact, women historically have had longer lifespans. Historically, women
can I anticipate? Can I anticipate a futile sidetrack that we might be tempted to go on at this point?
Okay,
we might be tempted. Yeah, so at this point we're going to be tempted to go through history and say who had it worse, right? Did the fact that huge numbers of men died in war and disease and backbreaking labor, did that outweigh the fact that they had marginally more political power when it came to the limited amount of decisions that they were allowed to make? I mean, and you could go down this and ask this question forever, but you won't get to the question is, it's just impossible to apply the sort of equalist standards to the societies as they existed more than 200 years ago. You just can't. Women could literally not fight in an 18th century war. Women literally could not do the work men were asked to do prior to 1800 for the most part, right?
Well, even after 1800 for the most part. I mean,
I'm not looking for.
You're right.
The main point is that the whole comparison seems to be ridiculous. It would be like, I don't know. It would be like going to an Aboriginal tribesman asking him how much vacation time he had, right?
Well,
you're taking these concepts that just don't translate into these earlier time periods. You're superimposing them on, and then you're coming up with this conspiracy theory to explain the discrepancy.
Well, David, I think what you're getting at is this. In 1800, we had the origin of the scientific and industrial. Well, the scientific revolution was a couple centuries earlier. We had the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. The main driving force that enabled women to do this was technology. It reduced the amount of physical strength that any
I
one
know,
person
but
needed.
do you understand the broad point that we might be using a comparison center that's not fair? That's a much more concise way of putting it.
Okay, sure.
Is that, Alex? You see that critique?
I can see your point. I wouldn't say I fully accept all of it, but I can see your point. I mean, I can see where you believe that. Yeah.
I mean, so if you went to a 16th century peasant's house and told them that the man had to spend equal times in the house and the woman had to push a plow, they'd laugh at you because that plow weighed it weighed a huge amount, right? Like, and it wouldn't be realistic, right? Less work would have gotten done, and these people were living hand to mouth.
Right. Yeah. And there are certain situations where it makes more or less sense. Like in a lot of Native American tribes, if you compare them to a lot of their sexist counterparts, you'll find that women do a lot of outdoor and backbreaking work in the Native American tribes.
Native American tribes were not agricultural, so the comparison immediately fails there.
No, they are agricultural. That's nonsense. They had agriculture.
Okay, hold on. Which Native American tribes? Some of the southern ones were, but for the most.
Well, I think by excuse me, what?
But what?
I was going to say with the Native American tribes, if you look at Mesoamerica, you had a highly stratified class society. So of course, I don't think he's talking about that, but those were agricultural. The Aztecs, the Inca, the Maya, but they were highly stratified empires. If you look at the most tribes north of the Rio Grande River were not agricultural. There were a few, but they were usually very small.
Okay, well, so that being said, I think we can understand the critique, right? Sorry, I'm going to cut you off, Todd, but I'm trying to avoid getting into more history. Than we need to make a point.
There was another point that I wanted to make, not about this, but about something that we talked about earlier.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The point that I was making was that, okay, when we look at the victimology, okay, so we have white institutions. Remember we talked about.
What again? What does that mean?
Well, what I meant was when white institutions, self-professed white institutions, self-professed male institutions, or self-professed Christian institutions are singled out for attack in the United States, whereas self-announced black, women's, or Muslim or atheist institutions are less so. Now, the thing is, they'll say, well, white people, America's been a white country, so we've historically had power. But nobody's ever going to apply a leftist power structure analysis to the Aztecs and claim that, the hierarchy and privilege of the Mexica Indians led to the exploitation of the Tlaxcala. That's never going to happen. And you're never going to have a left person say the exploitation of white farmers by the black ZANU government of Zimbabwe, or the genocide.
So this is your original critique?
But the double standard of attacking all white, all male.
Did Alex, in some sense, agree that this was not contested?
Well, he says
didn't he say he recognized some double standards? What?
He said they were ignorant of those facts, but they're only ignorant because they've been deliberately suppressed. It's not hard to find out that in 1805 the white people were all massacred in Haiti, and that it's not hard to find out that in 1982
most slave revolts result in a massacre of the ruling class.
But let's not even talk about that. Let's talk about Zimbabwe.
Okay. Well, regardless, I think so. Okay. So, are you making a critique on Todd? Are you making a critique of leftist education as it stands? Is that the direction you're going here?
Because what they're going to do is they're never going to say you have an intrinsically oppressive.
Well, when you say
black
they, you mean leftist educators. I want to be very specific. My goal is to get more specific when we talk in vague terms. So,
okay, I'm sorry.
Leftist education. No. I just want to make sure that we want to keep it on track, right?
The liberal intellectual establishment will never argue that there is an intrinsically that there can be intrinsically oppressive black power structures against non-blacks, whether they be white or whether they be Arab or whether they be Indian or whether they be mulattoes. It doesn't matter. They're never going to say that.
I have heard statements from liberal educators to the effect that non-whites could not be racist. Have you heard similar things, Alex, or would you support statements like that?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that if exploitation is happening, I'm going to call it exploitation.
Have you heard the blacks cannot be racist thing? I've heard that frequently come up in contexts like Black Lives Matter.
I hear a lot of argument about the term racism. So yeah, but I mean, there's people on both sides.
I'm not talking about. I'm sorry. When I ask you a question about these statements, I'm only asking you to speak for what you believe and not some larger movement.
Oh, okay. So, I mean,
you'd say that it is possible for, non-white people to be racist against white people, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you have a structure of racial domination in place, yeah.
Okay. So I think that's relative. Do you agree that there is Do you agree that there is a sort of radical school of racism theory that does not subscribe to this notion?
Yeah, I mean, it exists, definitely, sure.
Do you think that's a problem for us understanding and dealing with racism?
Yeah, I would think so, yeah.
Okay, so it looks like we agree on that then.
Okay, well,
all these areas I think there can be disagreement. It looks like there's just agreement. That's the thing, that's kind of odd, right? Actually, I have a question for Alex. So we're obviously I don't know exactly where Todd stands. I probably am on the right wing generally. Obviously, I'm a more conservative religious believer. I know that there's a lot of people who have very negative opinions about people in our community. Are there any sort of critiques you would like to bring against elements, just like Todd brought a critique against the liberal educational establishment? Do you think that there's critiques you would bring against people of a more traditionalist, conservative standpoint?
Well, my main critique would be the justification for instance, disagreeing with. I'm trying to think of how to put this. A lot of it has to. That's because the thing is, I grew up very traditional, but on the other hand, that kind of blinds me because I know what I've grown up with, and I don't know what's outside of that a lot. So I would say that I've been pretty dissatisfied with a lot of the justifications for traditional social.
Can you either move your microphone a little bit closer, or because you break up a little bit and it's hard to hear? You could just speak louder and make sure that there's a little bit of interference that makes it hard to hear. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, is this good? All right.
Yeah, a little bit better.
I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, sure. I would say that what I find most problematic is the lack of justifications for existing social norms and existing. I would also any kind of defense of capitalism there is. I mean, I can understand their problems with replacements. Yes, that's true. But
yes, go ahead. Keep on going.
I mean, that's true, but I think that evaluation of human life ought to push us to find some system that satisfies the well-being of all people rather than containing poverty of any kind, right?
Excuse me, Dave, I want to add something here. So, Alex, would you agree with the statement from Noam Chomsky that anarchism is the position that that they say no power structure is supporting or self-justification, that they have to justify themselves. You don't assume the power structure is legitimate. They have to provide a justification. And I think that's the definition that Noam Chomsky said for what he views anarchism is. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I suppose that makes some sense. I mean, if a structure of domination can't justify itself, that's problematic. But
I'm actually more interested in the leftist critique on the right, because anarchism is just so abstract that I feel pretty safe in saying that I'm never going to see it in my lifetime implemented, or if it is implemented, it'll be implemented on a small scale. I'm more interested in your criticism of the right wing, right? So when you said we don't have justification for traditionalist norms, what do you mean by that?
Well, I've heard a lot of ideas, for instance, about that morality should be, that the sort of traditional moral ideas should be preserved about, say, sexual norms or gender norms, and I just have a hard time finding any good arguments to support this.
Well, can I ask you, Alex, what what kind of argument would be persuasive to you? Because we don't want to demonstrate. We don't want to demonstrate what would convince us, because we're already convinced.
Right.
But what would it take to convince you? What kind of evidence or argument would one have to provide? That'd be the first question, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think a lot of problems and disagreements between the left and the right stem from the fact that they don't understand each other very well. But I'd argue that
that's what we're trying to achieve here, right?
Yeah. So what I'd say is the only arguments that could convince me that traditional norms of gender and sexuality should dominate society would be kind of a lifeboat kind of argument, where if we don't have them, there's going to be some serious problems. Because I don't see how in principle it makes any sense to support it.
Okay, so you're saying that basically, other than maybe extreme scenarios of dire survival, you really couldn't see that there'd be any legitimate reason in a normal business as usual society to do that.
Well, like a consequentialist sense.
Okay, so you're saying that the only consequence would be a harm consequence, right?
Well, yeah, I'm using that kind of reasoning, right?
Most people who adopt traditional sexual norms for themselves, the norms themselves aren't strongly linked to harm, although we certainly do believe that there are harms for not having traditional sexual norms, right?
Yeah. I want to ask Alex another question. Now, you and I have talked before, and I think when you ask what is good for society or what is good for an individual, you would, of course, couch that in the terms of, well, what increases their autonomy, which is a typical left libertarian position. And in that sense, their equality as well. There's this desire to increase equality, decrease inequality, and also increase individual autonomy, as I defined earlier. And I think for you, correct me if I'm wrong, that you would say something is good or beneficial if it helps one of those two outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not for mathematical equality, but equal access to resources, definitely.
Well, it's more like the closer. It's like absolute zero. You never get there, but you want to get as close as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so to maybe ask a different question, what kind of arguments would one have to provide to convince you that equality, that notion of equality and that notion of autonomy are not actually healthy for individuals?
The bigger question is this sort of a core belief, or is it some kind of like evidence belief that's based on a first principle that's more fundamental?
Which belief?
The two that I mentioned.
Yeah. Equality and I think equality basically, right?
Yeah, more or less. Like I said, I'm not really a stickler for absolutist equality at all. I'm just in favor of everyone sort of having, sort of a comfortable living, well-being, and sort of egalitarian social relations generally.
Well, I wasn't. I think you misunderstood the question, Alex. The question was, I understand that's what you mean by equality, and I will use your definition for the sake of this argument. But what I'm saying is, what arguments would one have to provide that would convince you that it's an unhealthy view of the good of a human life? Like, they say that, well, Alex, it's not actually the good you should aim for in a human life. What kind of arguments would one have to provide that would convince you that that's actually mistaken?
Well, it'd be, what arguments do you have in the first place? That would sort of be the first question I have.
Okay.
But I think that for Todd, equality itself is sort of a core value, and you can't interrogate core values for evidence, right?
Well, I would say this: the left liberals and left anarchists will often say, when they talk about power structures, which may or may not be oppressive, that they're not self-justifying; they have to be justified. But they never apply that principle to the principle of equality. Equality is not self-justifying; it has to be justified. And yet, while they're constantly demanding that power structures justify themselves, they never demand that the proponents of equality justify the principle of equality. I've never seen somebody do that, and I'd really like to see that.
Yeah, I mean, so that is, I mean, I guess if I understood whether Alex thought that equality was a means to an end, or whether it was just sort of like an end in itself.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if if we had your perfect anarchist utopia, and then we introduced into it a number of billionaires, the inequality of the society would go skyrocketing up. But would that be a problem for you? Like, to me, it really wouldn't be.
Well, I would argue that in the end, equality and the whole idea of socialism, the whole point of it is to produce material conditions that would be objectively better for everybody in terms of just, and I guess that you could go back to almost utilitarianism, right? Like creating well-being for all, right?
But you're aware of the core right-wing critique of equality in this dimension, right? That the obsession with equality as a means of quantifying utilitarianism presupposes sort of a notion of zero-sumness, such that I know that I have less because the other person has more.
Yeah, well, that's not an argument I would ever use.
No. The critique is that it essentially presupposes it, right? Like, what evidence do we have that equality is a good measure for proper utilitarian optimization, right?
Well, Dave, as an example, real quick. Let's say looking at a hunter-gatherer society, there's a general equality in physical goods.
Yes.
And the standard of living is really crappy. Whereas the United States today, there is a lot more inequality than in a hunter-gatherer society, but everybody has a much higher standard of living. So on utilitarian grounds, one could just as easily argue that the inequality produced by capitalism, however lamentable, leads to an objectively higher standard of living for everybody than it does for a hunter-gatherer society. I'm not saying I argue that. I'm just saying capitalists have argued that in the past. And it makes a certain utilitarian sense, I think.
Yeah, and I can understand that line of reasoning, and that's what I hear very frequently. However, I'd reject that argument wholesale, because if you're going to have benefits to society, they should be distributed in a way that's meaningful, not just to some, but to all, right?
Okay, so but that gets back to my earlier question. This principle of equality is not self-justifying. I've never seen a leftist provide a justification. It's something that's already assumed when they make the argument. And that's fine. We all have our own assumptions. But when they're constantly demanding that everybody else give justification for their structures of power, I think it's only fair that we demand the leftist give a justification for his belief in equality. And I've never seen that yet. And I'd like to know, what would your justification be for the legitimacy of that matrix of equality?
Well, I seem to have taken from Alex's previous answer that he believes that there are genuinely no economic states of distribution where you could get a higher average utility and it being maldistributed, right? Like, they're just not, those type of constraints don't exist, essentially, right? Well, why I say that there's simply no choices where you ever have to choose between lower wealth and equality and higher wealth and some amount of inequality. There's always the middle option of having higher wealth and equality.
Well, I'm not saying that that's always the case. What I'm saying is that we should aim to create a system where we do find a workable middle ground.
But here's the thing, Alex. You might be surprised, but when you say these things like, I'm going to enter into my main critique of what I heard you say. When I hear these things, like you said something like, well, we don't, people don't look for alternatives to capitalism. I mean, it's not that people on the right aren't interested in finding alternatives to the problems of capitalism. Like, we just tend to think that these alternatives that keep on getting brought up again and again and again manifestly don't work. And I hate to say it, but there seems to be just a very convincing body of evidence, both empirically and I mean, I'm not saying there's no answer to it, right? All I'm saying is that we believe there's fundamental problems that the alternatives we've heard so far just don't answer and don't seem to really take account of, I suppose.
Right, and I can definitely respect that. And I'll admit there are blank spaces that I don't have filled in with my belief system as a socialist. and I'm comfortable admitting that. But that's, that being said, I'm not as well researched as a lot of socialists out there, and I haven't had time to review the literature on alternatives, so I'm not going to claim that I would know.
We're kind of nearing the end of probably where we want to take this hangout, because I know that Todd's on the East Coast, and Alex, are you on East Coast time or West Coast time?
East Coast.
Yeah, we're on the
East
same
Coast.
time. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys are probably getting pretty late there. I guess I kind of wanted to ask Alex a little bit more about culture before we sort of summarized, what's wrong with the world and what we think are going forward. To tell you the truth, I'm always surprised talking to progressives how much we have in common, right? Usually the main disagreements are, he thinks System X can hypothetically work, and I think it won't work.
Well, I think the differences arise from how the means to the end. We would disagree on the means to be used for the desired end. But we also might disagree on the desired end as well, because I don't think you and I, Dave, would consider equality of that kind to be a desirable end.
Equality in and of itself is a totally neutral proposition to me, right? I guess, like, all things being the same, I guess equality is hypothetically better than not, but insofar as I can have independent, autonomous individuals who are able to live their lives, I'll embrace or not embrace equality as it seems to be recommended by the current situations and evidence, right?
Well, there's also multiple kinds of equality. There's equality before the law, which states that whether you're male or female, white or black, adult or child, you'll be treated the same in the court of law.
But that's a very different thing than what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, that's different than the equality of outcomes that Alex seems to be in favor of.
And I really do hate the word equality. I normally don't use it too much, but I'm much more concerned with economic and social relationships.
What do you prefer?
Well, and that's a difficult question because I haven't quite decided yet. That's why I said, I even talked to Todd, and I said, well, look, I've been kind of reconsidering different parts of anarchism myself. But because if you look backwards, if you look before the Industrial Revolution, what you had during that time was the breakdown of a lot of different forms of the social division of labor. And what ended up happening is a lot of the workers revolted as a result. So you had a lot of workers breaking machinery, alcoholism shot through the roof, all sorts of social issues. Families spent less time together, and it generally produced a lot of social problems, which have followed us to this day. And so I'm looking for an economy that can have worker empowerment, autonomy of the group and the individual, and productivity and innovation all at the same time.
Real quick, would I just ask you this question? Would you agree? I mean, I think that could probably work on a small scale. I think the larger the scale, the less likely it could work. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I've heard the critique. I'm not sure I buy that sentiment, but I can see where you're coming from.
I mean, I would say sure. I mean, if some individuals preferred to organize like that on a local level, again, the kibbutzim is an example I'm surprised isn't used more often. It was a very successful attempt at that, for a time anyhow. Nowadays, the kibbutzim is mostly privatized, but I feel like that the larger it would get, even if it is functional at a small level, it would begin to break down as it grew to larger levels.
Yeah, and I also noticed that, so I think that kind of rounds up the economic disagreement. It definitely seems that on the economic side, we're definitely arguing over workability. On the cultural side, there might be more disagreement. We didn't touch on that we touched on that a little bit in this conversation. I think that probably Todd and I believe that I'm certainly libertarian in the sense that I would never want government to do any of these things, right? But I definitely do believe there are a set of social practices that people can call right and wrong that don't just apply to consent, right? So I would say, for instance, adultery is wrong, even if both the people who are having sex consent to that adultery, right? I can say that, like, promiscuity of both men and women is wrong, despite the fact that both people consent to it, right? And I get the sense from Alex that perhaps he would believe that these statements would of consent or direct harm, that those observations would not be legitimate, right? Or they would be legitimate. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I mean, obviously, with you talked about adultery, you don't have the consent of the other parties. So that is, yeah, that's definitely a huge problem.
Why do you require it?
Because I would argue that any sexual exchange at all requires consent.
No,
That's
Dave,
the parties
Dave,
involved, not the parties
Dave.
not involved, right?
Well, what he's saying is, if there's adultery, at least one of those individuals is married, and presumably the other spouse did not consent to that. And
no,
you're saying,
I understand what's wrong with it from sort of like a Christian, Platonic, Aristotelian point of view. I don't understand what's wrong with it from a more secular point of view, I suppose. If marriage is just, like, for instance, right, like, I mean, if marriage is just like, a piece of paper or whatever, I mean, why not? Or, or even, I could come up with other examples of consensual sexual acts that I might consider wrong, right?
Right.
I always bring up this one, too. An interesting thing that I've never really understood was attitudes, the attitudes towards, so it's very obvious why certain things like sexual assault would be egregious from a Christian point of view, right? But it's not so clear why sexual assault would be more egregious than non-sexual assault from a secular point of view.
I don't think they would say that. I mean, I think
they wouldn't. I never understood why. I never understood why that was the case, though, right? I guess I'm sorry. I'm kind of going on aggression now, right? I guess my whole point is that I think that it is true. Progressives don't seem to understand the more traditional view of sexuality and ethics, but I would very forcefully make the case that if you look at it as a whole, the traditional perspective on sexuality is much more coherent than the progressive one, right? And a lot of times, progressives don't like them.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I can understand conservatives to some degree on this. There's certain, I mean, just going based on the Bible, or
for instance, do you support polygamy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with polygamy and polyamory. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so you're fine with polygamy, and I assume.
Hold on, Dave. I think I know where you're trying to go, and I just want to try to phrase this in a way that maybe might be coherent to David. I think what Alex. I think what David's trying to say is, according to progressive principles, why would any form of sexuality be considered deviant? And there are some that even the left would consider deviant. I mean, for instance, rape is one, obviously.
Well, Todd, that has an easy answer because of the consent exception, right? It's not, though, so clear why, from a leftist point of view, rape would be worse than, say, beating somebody up, right?
I don't think they say, though, that beating someone up is less bad than being raped. I think they'd say they're both pretty bad.
I don't know. Most feminists say that rape is a uniquely terrible crime.
Okay, well,
under Christianity, rape is a uniquely terrible crime, right? I don't understand why to me, obviously, I believe rape is a uniquely terrible crime. I don't necessarily understand what justifies that under a secular worldview.
I get it, yeah.
But no, rape obviously, if Alex was just to argue a harm perspective, rape would easily be accounted for by the fact that it is an act of violence. I think adultery would be much harder because adultery is not violence in any sense of the word, right? And the only way that adultery is wrong is some sort of property claim that one party has over the other because of words spoken, on a different day, which doesn't really make sense to me, right? Like, it doesn't make sense on the progressive worldview that adultery would be wrong.
Well, that depends. And if I may clarify a few things about adultery, first of all, we on the left do take social commitments and relationships pretty seriously, and so, like and that's part of that is consent, right? So, I'm okay with polyamory because all parties consent, right? Distinguish that from adultery, where 2 out of the 4 people don't consent, and that is, to me, that proves harm is happening.
But adultery, the only people participating in the sexual act are consenting.
Yeah, but you're also linking in people who are in the relationship with them. You can't.
But by your implicit association, I mean, like, are you saying that consent is required from external parties before a sexual act can occur?
Involved parties, I would say, and in this case, the other people in the relationship are definitely involved and are affected by affected parties. Yeah.
Okay, but that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to me from a variety of point of views. I mean, but we're coming to the end, I suppose. Which, I mean, I know you guys are getting late, but this doesn't make sense to me because it seems to be pathologically elevating some statements above others, right? I mean, if I were promiscuous, I would like go around like saying, "Oh, hey, baby, I'll be with you forever," right? Every philanderer does this, right? You know, and then like, okay, the next day you'll sleep with another woman, right? Like, okay, so is he engaging in unconsensual sex doing that?
Well, hold on, Dave. I want to clarify, Alex. I think what Alex is saying is that sometimes all that matters is 2 consenting adults having sex. That will be the case if they're both single. But if they're both married, then those 2 separate parties have made public commitments to another party that isn't being consulted. And so the fact that in this case there is a public commitment that has been made as a new level that would be absent if they were single. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Exactly. I knew what you were saying. That okay.
No, I still don't understand why marriage is elevated in that way. Unless you believe it's sacred somehow.
No, I'm not saying that marriage is elevated. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that marriage is like any other relationship.
You're saying that the commitments made under marriage would be different than commitments spoken in another context.
I think they're both effective.
Well, what
okay,
else?
so then my philanderer argument has full force, right? The philanderer that goes around offering pillow talk commitments to his one-night stands would be effectively as wrong as the person who cheated on his wife.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Well, what Alex is saying is, Dave, what Alex is saying is this: is that if you make a public commitment of whatever kind, marriage, an agreement to perform obligated service, otherwise called a contract, you made a public commitment, and that adds a level of concerned interests, right? Alex says that,
I understand the public commitment argument. I think, I mean, to me it just seems like this is going away from the typical sexual revolution notion that.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, I think it is in the sense that, like you would point out, he's saying that. Well, I don't know. Would it even really be? Because
okay, but my only point here was to say that I get the impression, talking to a lot of progressives, that they intend to keep some of the patrimony of traditional values while discarding the ones that they don't particularly like. And I'm not so sure that the consent argument is true all the way down, unless you have a very, very loose idea of consent.
Well, no, what we're saying, and what I'm saying, is that when you look at relationships we think should mean something beyond just, they should be honest and they should be ethical.
Well, who thinks this? You think this?
Yeah.
Like your view of relationships should be more morally enthroned.
Hold on, Dave, hold on. I think I want to explain, Alex, what
I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Well, I know, but what I think Dave is trying to say this. The fact that, okay, there are certain values that the left has that are shared with conservatives because they are sort of like intellectual holdovers from an earlier age. And it's kind of a taxi cab fallacy where you use liberal principles to undermine a great deal of conservative values, but then for a random dispersion among different leftists hold different individual conservative beliefs that lack the foundation to believe them because they've already been undermined by the persistent left-wing critique. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, most progressives I meet do not want legalized polygamy. Most progressives I meet, well, some anarchists I meet think that adultery is fine. Some think it's not fine, right? I mean, there's no consistent idea here. It just, you find a certain number of these consensual arrangements objectionable, and so you define consent broadly to keep some of the ones you like in and the ones you don't like out. I don't think there's a coherent worldview anywhere here.
Well, let me explain a little bit more then, because what you've stated is that we have certain marriage norms, right? That we accept certain ideas about marriage. Well, my whole
being progressives or
me or progressives or whatever, right? When it comes to adultery,
right, monogamy would be an instance, and also, how about this is another one, right? Another one that's been challenged by progressives is traditionally marriage is lifelong. It's sexually monogamous it's sexually monogamous, and it's it's heterosexual. I'm sorry. So my understanding is that all three of these things would essentially be done away with, right? That essentially marriage could be terminated at any point without objection. They would only last as long as they felt good, and then they would also be sexually open, right?
If that's what people want to do, sure.
Okay, I mean, then at that point, why even have a word?
Well, here's my...
Hello?
Did he cut out again?
Yeah, I think so. Alex, are you there?
Let's wait a moment.
Okay, yeah. I guess we're kind of coming to the end of this because I know it's getting very late on your guys' end.
I think when he gets back, we should just wrap it up. But
yeah, let's wrap it up when he gets back.
The thing that I want to say is, and I think this is the important thing, because whenever part of it is, I think Alex is right. There's a difficulty in understanding what each side is saying. Now, I've tried this to translate you to him and him to you, and I think I've been pretty successful.
Yeah,
what do you
you've
think?
been good at making clarifications.
Because
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I have interacted with that milieu of the left.
Oh, I live in it, so.
Reading their literature and then sometimes interacting with them.
Sure,
and I'm like, well, I know what they mean when they say that, but it's I think what you and I would agree with is that, I mean, fundamentally it's just completely ad hoc and nonsensical, because if you're going to attack the foundations of conservative traditional values, then you have to reject all of them. As Friedrich Nietzsche said in Twilight of the Idols, once you get rid of God, all moral principles that derive from God are gone.
Yeah.
If you don't understand that, then you need help with philosophy.
Oh.
Well, I mean, Nietzsche makes this, the argument, and I would say that you could, using a broad definition of God, like deism or natural law, first principles, it's very hard to kind of abstract them and take out certain elements. Or I guess you can to a certain extent, but I think that progressivism, to this extent, in terms of culture, I don't think it's really thought about the consequences of certain decisions they've made about what constitutes morally laudable sexual interaction and what constitutes morally deplorable. Hello?
No, he's not there. It's just me.
Yeah, it's fine. It's gonna. I think we're just gonna wrap this up without him. We'll have to thank Alex for joining. But just to wrap it up, like, I just think that there's a hole there, and it will have to be addressed at some point, right?
Well, yeah, but even in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche was specifically identifying the Christian God as an author of a certain kind of morality that certain members of the left would still hold to parts of.
Yeah, I think he called them worshippers of the shadow of God, right?
And he also, well, not only that, Max Stirner made the same argument in The Ego in His Own. He said that the atheists are the most pious people because they take these Christian ideas that they have no justification for believing anymore, and then they just believe them, even though their own atheism, their own humanism and progressivism would actually undermine the validity of such a belief. And
Yeah.
that's the point you've been making. How can you believe this stuff if you don't believe in the only really consistent atheists were Friedrich Nietzsche and Max Stirner. They actually understood the implications.
Well, it'd be interesting to have more progressives on. If we're going to do this regularly, we should definitely seek to have that, and maybe we should constrain ourselves to a more formatted discussion in the future, right?
Yeah, I think one of there was a couple of things that I thought was problematic about tonight.
I think the audio quality was probably primary among them.
The technical issues on Alex's side were very unfortunate. It really disrupted a lot of our conversation.
Yeah.
I think another thing that was somewhat problematic was, there just seemed to be, like you said, a certain lack of structure.
I'll try to enforce that more next time. I wasn't aware Alex was going to be here, so I wasn't prepared with any questions for progressives, right?
No, that's fine. This was totally spur of the moment, and he's back. So
okay, great. So we're wrapping up now, right? So that was a very, very long discussion about what's wrong with the world. We touched on a lot of points. To tell you the truth, Alex, I wasn't really prepared to have a progressive voice in this conversation, so I didn't really prepare structured or interrogative questions beforehand. But thank you for joining nonetheless, and I think it's been enlightening all around. So how about we just
let Alex have the final word. How about you go first, then I, then Alex?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll just I'll start my final word, then Todd can go, and then Alex will have the final word. So I think that we just overviewed some objections that were basically economic problems in the world and cultural problems in the world. And we discussed them at length. And I think for the most part, what we discovered was that the economic disagreements between left and right, or traditionalist and progressive, were mainly due to a belief that progressive proposed alternatives would not work, right? But that fundamentally a lot of our values on the economic side were similar. However, on the cultural side, I think we determined that the root cause of the disagreement was not a practical one, rather, but sort of a fundamental question about values. And that probably would be more interesting to interrogate if we were to pick up a topic with a progressive in future podcasts.
Yeah, my final words would be similarly on the line. I think when it comes to economics, we tend to agree on the observable pathologies, the observable facts that this is not working right. But we do disagree on not only the means to the end, but even the end itself. What is the end game for this alternative economic system? And when it comes to social issues, I think it's more fundamental. It's not just that we disagree with the observable pathologies in society, but we also disagree about the fundamental principles of what would be a good or bad society. And so I think there's more. On economic issues, the disagreement is less strong. I mean, for instance, many 19th century progressives were conservatives, like William James Bryan is a socially conservative, but economically very progressive. But, so yeah, I would tend to agree with how you would say that we would not line up. So, yeah, that's my last words.
Alex, are you there and able to talk?
Yeah. Am I coming through clear?
Yeah, clear enough. But how about you just give what you think was said, what your conclusions were, and then we'll close the podcast out. And also, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for allowing me to join.
No, all the time. We're probably doing more of these podcasts in the future, and you're always welcome to join. I like disagreement, so... Anyway, go ahead. Give your last word.
Sure. I pretty much think the same thing. Though I think we could agree on at least some core values. Fairness, harm, and I mean, of course, you all are going to be higher on the traditional scale than I'm going to be when it comes to social values. Mm-hmm. But even then, I'm curious as to why traditional institutions evolved the way they did, and if we still need them, why so? And so why should we defend or criticize them? So I think there's a lot more room there. But overall, I'm very intrigued.
That's a very good point, and I think that we'll end there, but I will point out that for future podcasts, we should definitely discuss what Alex just mentioned there.
Exactly, we should.
Okay, great. I think since we let Alex have the last word, let's close there. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we can continue the podcasting, right? Maybe with a more structured format after our initial pilot episode.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for coming. Bye.